Hello everyone, in today's video I will be narrating stories that I found off of Reddit. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But without further ado,
let's get straight into these stories.
I travel for work a lot, so airports have become a second home. The bright lights, endless corridors, and the hum of announcements are oddly comforting. But there's one layover I'll never forget, and it's the reason I refuse to fly through Salt Lake City anymore. It was late, a red-eye flight connecting to a 6 a.m. departure. My connecting gate was at the far end of the terminal, the kind where you wonder if the gate is even real. The closer I got, the fewer people I saw. Shops were closed, lights were dimmed, and the sound of my rolling suitcase echoed louder than it should. When I arrived at gate 72B, it was empty, completely empty. No agent, no passengers, just a flickering screen displaying the flight information. The gate seating area was tucked into a corner with no windows, so it felt like I was boxed in. The chairs were that dull gray vinyl, the kind that looks perpetually uninviting. I settled into one near an outlet and plugged in my phone. I hadn't been sitting for more than a few minutes when I felt watched, not in the usual someone glances at you at passing way. This felt like a deliberate, lingering presence. I looked around, but the only movement came from a janitor buffing the floors at a distance. I shook it off. Airports can be eerie when they're so quiet. That's when I noticed the gate next to mine, 72A. It looked identical to mine but darker, like the lights hadn't been fully turned on. I couldn't see anyone over there, yet I swear I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. A shadow, quick and fluid, passed by the chairs. I stared at the gate, but there was nothing, just rows of empty seats and the muted hum of the ventilation system. I checked my phone, 2:43 a.m. still hours to go. I decided to walk back toward the shops to get a drink, partly to wake myself up and partly to shake the unease. As I stood, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The screen at gate 72A had flickered on. It displayed a destination I didn't recognize, Hollow Pines, boarding now. There was no airline logo, no gate agent, no passengers, just that ominous message. I glanced toward the janitor, hoping for some reassurance, but he was gone, not just out of sight. His machine was abandoned mid-floor, the cord still snaking toward an outlet. I decided I'd had enough. I grabbed my bag and started walking briskly back toward the more populated part of the terminal. But as I passed 72A, I heard a faint, metallic sound like keys jangling. It came from the darkened gate. Against my better judgment, I glanced over. There was a figure. It stood by the boarding door, half obscured in shadow. I couldn't make out much, but it was tall and unnaturally still, like a mannequin someone had forgotten to move. The jangle came again, and I saw its hand, a skeletal-shaped clutching what looked like a ring of keys. I didn't stick around to investigate. I bolted, not caring if I looked insane. When I reached the more populated part of the terminal, I told a TSA agent about what I'd seen. He frowned, glanced at his watch, and said something that still chills me. 72A. That gate's been closed for years. The door doesn't even open anymore. I didn't sleep for the rest of the layover. When I finally boarded my flight, I made sure to sit far from the window. As the plane taxied out, I couldn't stop myself from looking back at the terminal. There was gate 72A, its darkened corner just barely visible. And standing there, near the glass, was a figure. Watching it, I spent the entire flight trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe I was just overtired, hallucinating after a long day of travel. Airports can feel like liminal spaces, places where reality seems thinner. That had to be it, I told myself. But the more I tried to convince myself, the less I believed it. When I landed at my destination, I couldn't shake the feeling that I brought something back with me. Every little noise, a cough from a passenger, the clink of a coffee cup, made me jump. I hurried out of the airport and straight to my hotel, hoping some sleep would settle my nerves. It didn't. That night, I had a nightmare so vivid it still haunts me. In it, I was back in Salt Lake City, standing at gate 72A. The figure with the keys was closer this time, its features clearer. Its skin was pale and papery, stretched taut over a face that didn't seem right. Its eyes were sunken and dark, as if they'd been scooped out and replaced with endless voids. It didn't move like a person. It twitched, jerked, and glided forward in unnatural bursts, the jangling of the keys growing louder and louder. When it was just a few feet away, it extended a hand, bony, with fingers far too long. It didn't speak, but I heard a voice in my head, low and hollow, "Your boarding pass." I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. The clock on the nightstand read 3:03 a.m. I sat up, trying to catch my breath, when I noticed something that made my stomach turn. On the desk in the corner of my hotel room was my boarding pass from the previous day. I could have sworn I left it in my bag, but there it was, perfectly laid out and folded in half. I didn't touch it. Instead, I grabbed my phone to distract myself, but my phone screen wouldn't turn on. No matter what I did, pressing buttons, plugging it in. It stayed dead. Frustrated and unnerved, I looked back toward the desk. The boarding pass was gone. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. As soon as the sun rose, I packed my bags and went straight to the lobby, asking for an early checkout. I told myself it was paranoia, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in that room. Back home, things seemed to settle. I avoided flying for a while, opting for virtual meetings whenever possible. But even now, months later, I feel like something has shifted. Every so often, when I'm in a quiet room, I'll hear a faint jingle like keys swaying on a ring. Last week, I found an old boarding pass tucked into a drawer I never use. It wasn't one I'd kept. This one was for a flight to Hollow Pines. The date, 2 days from now. I threw it out immediately, but I'm afraid it doesn't matter. The jingle of the keys has gotten louder. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I'll catch a flicker of movement in the corner of my vision. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Whatever had attached itself to me from gate 72A wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It was real, and it wasn't going away. The night before the date on the mysterious boarding pass, I didn't sleep. I locked every door, closed every curtain, and sat in my living room with every light on. I clutched my phone like a lifeline, ready to call someone, anyone, if something happened, but the house was oppressively silent, as if the world outside had ceased to exist. At 3:03 a.m., the same time I'd woken from my nightmare in the hotel, the power went out. The darkness was instant and suffocating. My phone, which had been fully charged, suddenly wouldn't turn on. The only light was the faint glow of the moon through a gap in the curtains. And then I heard it. The keys. The sound was unmistakable, a soft jingle growing louder with each passing second. I wanted to run, but I couldn't tell where it was coming from. It seemed to echo from everywhere at once. I grabbed a flashlight from a drawer and turned it on. The beam sliced through the darkness, but it didn't offer much comfort. The sound was closer now, coming from the hallway leading to my bedroom. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might give out. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling. No response, just the keys, jangling in a slow, deliberate rhythm. I pointed the flashlight toward the hallway, and that's when I saw it. The figure from gate 72A was standing at the end of the corridor, its bony hand clutching the ring of keys. It didn't move, but its presence filled the entire house, suffocating and cold. The flashlight flickered, and in that moment, I thought I was done for. But then it did something I wasn't expecting. It extended its hand, just like in my dream. And in its other hand, it held something I hadn't noticed before, a boarding pass. The pass floated toward me, as if pushed by an invisible wind. It landed at my feet, face up. The flight information was clear: Hollow Pines, gate 72A. Departure now. My name was printed on it, just as it had been on the pass I'd thrown away. The figure took a step forward, and then another, its jerky, unnatural movements making my stomach churn. The keys jingled with every motion. I backed away, but it was no use. I was trapped. In desperation, I shouted, "I'm not going with you." The figure stopped. It tilted its head, as if considering my words. Then, without warning, it let out a sound, a low, guttural laugh that resonated through the entire house. The boarding pass at my feet burst into flames, burning away to ash in seconds. The figure turned and began to fade, its form dissolving into shadows. But just before it disappeared completely, it spoke in that hollow, mind-penetrating voice. "You'll board eventually." The lights came back on, and the house was silent once more. My phone buzzed to life in my hand, showing several missed calls and messages. I didn't care. I collapsed onto the couch, shaking and exhausted. That was 3 days ago. Since then, the keys have stopped jingling, and I haven't seen the figure again. But I know it's not over. I've started finding boarding passes in strange places, on my desk at work, inside my car, even slipped under my pillow. They're all for Hollow Pines, all marked with different departure dates. This happened a few years ago when I worked as a landscaper for a private estate in a small town. The estate was massive, almost like a small village within itself, with beautifully maintained gardens, stone fountains, and hedgerows that seemed to stretch forever. Most of the grounds were open and welcoming, but there was one section that was always locked, the walled garden. It was a relic from the estate's original design, a high, ivy-covered wall enclosing about an acre of land. The gate to the garden was an old, rusted wrought iron door with a massive padlock. The owner of the estate, an elderly man who rarely left the manor, told me to never worry about it. "Nothing's back there worth your time," he said with a vague wave of his hand. "It's just a place for old memories." For months, I didn't think much about it. The grounds were beautiful and extensive enough to keep me busy. But one day, while trimming hedges along the wall, I noticed something odd. Behind the gate, I could faintly hear the sound of leaves crunching. It wasn't windy, and it wasn't the sound of animals, at least, not any I recognized. It sounded deliberate, like footsteps. I leaned closer, trying to peer through the gaps in the iron gate, but all I could see was dense, overgrown greenery. It wasn't a well-kept part of the property, so I figured it could have been a deer or something similar. I let it go, but the sound stayed with me. Over the next few weeks, I started hearing other noises whenever I was near the garden, whispers, faint and fragmented, like a conversation just out of earshot. One day, I was working near the wall when I heard a distinct laugh, a child's laugh, bright and clear, like it was right on the other side of the gate. By this point, curiosity got the better of me. I asked the estate's caretaker, an older woman named Martha, about the garden. Her face turned pale, and she avoided my eyes. "It's nothing you need to concern yourself with," she said sharply. "Just don't go near it." Her reaction only fueled my curiosity. That evening, as I was finishing up my work, I noticed the gate to the garden was ajar. The padlock dangled from the door, unlocked and swinging slightly in the breeze. I froze. No one ever went back there, and the owner had the only key, at least, as far as I knew. I hesitated, but the whispers started again, louder this time, like they were beckoning me inside. Against my better judgment, I pushed the gate open and stepped into the garden. The air was heavy, damp, and smelled of earth and decay. The garden was overgrown with wildflowers and thick vines, and the sunlight barely pierced through the canopy of trees. It was eerily quiet. No birds, no insects, just the muffled sound of my footsteps on the soft ground. As I ventured deeper, I noticed something strange. The garden seemed larger on the inside than it looked from the outside. I turned around to find the gate, but it was nowhere in sight. The path behind me was swallowed by the greenery. Panic set in, and I started walking faster, calling out for help. That's when I saw them, figures moving through the foliage. Not animals, not people, but shadows that flitted just at the edge of my vision. They didn't make a sound, but I felt them watching me. I ran. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I burst through the trees and stumbled back onto the estate's lawn. The gate was closed behind me, the padlock securely fastened. My hands were trembling, and my breath came in ragged gasps. The next day, I quit. I didn't bother explaining why. I just packed my tools and left. A week later, I received a letter from Martha. It was short, with just one line: "You're lucky you found your way out." Others weren't so fortunate. I couldn't get the garden out of my mind, even after I left the estate. The whispers, the laughter, the figures, I questioned my sanity daily. At first, I told myself it was just a trick of the mind, that I let my curiosity and exhaustion get the better of me. But then, the dreams started. In my dreams, I was back in the garden, but it was even larger than before. The overgrowth had been replaced with meticulously kept rows of flowers and perfectly trimmed hedges, but the place was no less suffocating. The shadows were clear in my dreams, tall and possibly thin figures with elongated limbs and faces that seemed to shift and blur if I looked at them too long. They never spoke, but they always moved closer. One night, I woke up covered in dirt, my hands scratched and bleeding as if I'd been digging in my sleep. I checked the locks on my apartment door and windows. They were all secure. How had I gotten outside? Or had I? The dirt didn't feel like it came from my small backyard. It was damp and smelled faintly of that same garden. I tried to move on with my life, but strange things kept happening. I'd find ivy growing along my apartment walls, even though I lived on the second floor. I hear faint whispers when I was alone, though they always stopped the moment I turned to look. My reflection in the mirror seemed off, like it was moving just a split second out of sync with me. Then I received another letter, this time with no return address. The handwriting was shaky, as if whoever wrote it had been trembling. "You shouldn't have gone in. They've noticed you now. They always notice. Leave." There was no name at the bottom, but I recognized Martha's handwriting. I packed a bag and left town the next day, moving halfway across the country to stay with my sister. For a while, things were quiet. I didn't dream about the garden anymore, and the whispers stopped. I started to believe that whatever was happening to me had finally ended. But then, last week, my sister mentioned something that sent chills down my spine. She said her youngest daughter, Lily, had been talking to an invisible friend. When I asked her about it, she laughed it off, saying it was probably just an imaginary playmate. Out of curiosity and a growing sense of dread, I asked Lily about her friend. She gave me the kind of look that only little kids can give, as if I was the one being silly. "They said you'd come back soon," she said matter-of-factly. "They miss you." I froze, my heart pounding. "Who, Lily? Who Mrs. May?" She just smiled and pointed out the window to the backyard. It was empty, just a patch of grass and a few trees. But as I stared, I swear I saw the faint outline of a high, ivy-covered wall. After Lily's chilling words, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I glanced out the window, I half expected to see that ivy-covered wall. At first, I tried to dismiss it as paranoia, but my sister noticed my unease. "You okay?" she asked one evening, her brow furrowed. "You've been jumpy since you got here." I wanted to tell her everything, about the estate, the garden, the shadows, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. She wouldn't believe me. Heck, I didn't fully believe me. So I just nodded and mumbled something about needy rest. That night, I woke to the sound of laughter, not Lily's laughter, though it was higher pitched, almost ethereal, and it sent a chill down my spine. I bolted upright in bed, straining to hear. The sound was faint but unmistakable. unmistakable, drifting in from outside. Against every instinct screaming at me to stay put, I crept to the window. The backyard was bathed in pale moonlight, and for a moment, everything looked normal. Then I saw it. It was there, just as it had been on the estate. Tall, covered in thick ivy, and impossibly out of place in my sister's yard. My breath caught in my throat as I spotted movement near the base of the wall. Shadows, those same elongated figures, slipped between the vines, their blurred faces turned toward the house. I stumbled back from the window, my heart racing. The laughter grew louder, almost mocking, as if they knew I'd seen them. That's when I heard Lily's voice. Though here, her voice was coming from the hallway outside my room. I rushed to the door and yanked it open, expecting to find her standing there. Instead, the hallway was empty. My sister's bedroom door was closed, and the house was silent, except for the whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I ran to Lily's room. She was sitting on her bed, staring out the window. The same smile she'd given me earlier was plastered on her face. "They want you to come back," she said without turning around. "You shouldn't have left." I grabbed her and carried her out of the room, my mind racing. I didn't know what I was doing, only that I had to get her away from that window, away from the wall. My sister met me in the hallway, groggy and confused, but I didn't have time to explain. "We need to leave," I told her. Now, to her credit, she didn't argue. Maybe she saw the panic in my eyes, or maybe she heard the whispers too. We bundled Lily into the car and drove to a motel on the edge of town. My sister asked questions, but I couldn't give her any answers that made sense. That night at the motel, I didn't sleep. I kept the lights on and watched the windows, half expecting the wall to appear again. It didn't, but the whispers never stopped. They were faint, like a distant radio signal, but they were always there. The next morning, I knew what I had to do. I couldn't let this thing, whatever it was, follow my sister and Lily. I had to go back. I left them at the motel, promising I'd return, though I wasn't sure if that was true. I drove back to the estate, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they hurt. The closer I got, the heavier the air seemed to grow. By the time I reached the gates, I was shaking. The estate looked abandoned. The gardens were overgrown, the manor dark and lifeless. Then the walled garden. The gate was open, the padlock gone. I don't remember walking inside. One moment, I was standing at the threshold. The next, I was deep in the garden, surrounded by that oppressive greenery. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening. The shadows were everywhere, darting between the trees and bushes. "You came back," a voice said, clear and sharp. It wasn't a whisper. It wasn't a shadow. It was something else, something tall and impossibly still, standing at the center of the garden. Its face shifted and blurred, just like the figures I'd seen before. "You belong here." I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The air felt thick, like I was sinking into the ground. The whispers grew louder, overlapping and merging until they were a single, droning hum. I don't remember much after that. When I woke up, I was lying on the lawn outside the garden, the gate closed and locked behind me. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a message from my sister. "We're okay." The whisper stopped. Lily doesn't remember anything. I stared at the gate for a long time before I got back in my car and drove away. I don't know what happened in that garden or why it let me leave, but I know one thing for sure. I'm never going back. It started on a chilly September evening. I had just finished dinner and decided to take my dog, Daisy, for a walk. Daisy was a sprightly golden retriever who loved our nightly outings, especially as the leaves began to crunch underfoot. We usually walked the same route, a loop around the neighborhood and a quick pass by the old train depot, which had been converted into a local history museum. But that night, Daisy was unusually jittery. She tugged at her leash in a way that wasn't playful. Her ears were up, and she kept glancing back. I chalked it up to her sensing a raccoon or stray cat, but I couldn't shake the unease that crept into my chest. As we approached the depot, I noticed something odd. There was a bright blue bike leaning against the side of the building. Not just any bike, it was one of those old-fashioned ones with a big front wheel and tiny back wheel. It stood out, almost cartoonishly, against the backdrop of the dimly lit museum. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe someone was taking photos for a quirky Instagram post, or I left it as part of some art project. But as we passed, I heard the faintest sound of giggling. Not children's giggles, mind you, but something breathy and low, like someone was deliberately trying to stifle laughter. I stopped in my tracks, my heart thudding in my chest. Daisy growled, a sound I'd never heard from her before. It wasn't her playful rumble when she had a toy in her mouth. This was deep and menacing. "Hello," I called out, my voice wavering in silence. Then, from behind the bike, a shadow shifted. I swear I didn't move like a person. It almost flowed, smooth and unnatural. Before I could process what I was seeing, a figure stepped into the faint light of the depot's lamppost. The person, I think it was a person, was dressed in a tattered suit, but their face was obscured by an oversized mask. It was a crude, papier-mâché thing with exaggerated features painted in garish colors. The mouth of the mask was pulled into a wide grin, but the eyes were were blank, just two hollow, black holes. I froze, unsure if I was looking at some eccentric artist or something more sinister. Daisy barked wildly, straining at her leash as the figure tilted its head, as if studying us. Then it giggled again, louder this time, almost a cackle. I didn't wait to find out what they wanted. "Let's go, Daisy," I whispered, yanking her leash and breaking into a jog. We didn't stop until we were back on my porch. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I glanced back toward the street, half expecting to see that blue bike parked at the end of my driveway, but there was nothing. The next day, I told a few friends about what happened. They brushed it off, saying it was probably some weirdo pulling a prank. I wanted to believe them, but something didn't sit right. A week later, I saw the bike again. This time, it was leaning against a tree on my walking route, far from the depot. There was no one around, no giggling, no figure, just the bike, as if it was waiting for me. I haven't walked that road since. In fact, I moved out of that town altogether a few months later, but sometimes, when I'm out and about in my new city, I'll spot a flash of bright blue in the corner of my eye. It's always just a coincidence, a kid's toy, a parked bike, but my stomach knots every time. Even though I had moved away, the memories of that night lingered like a bad dream. I kept rationalizing it to myself. It was probably some eccentric performance artist or a harmless prank. Yet, deep down, I knew there was something wrong about the entire situation, something that didn't quite fit into the realm of logic. Months went by without incident, and I began to let my guard down. I convinced myself that I was overreacting, that I was safe now, but that sense of safety didn't last. One evening, as I walked home from a nearby park in my new neighborhood, I saw it again, the bike. It wasn't identical, but it was close enough. The same oversized front wheel and tiny back wheel, painted in that glaring, unnatural shade of blue. It was leaning casually against a lamp post on the corner near my apartment building. I stopped in my tracks, heart pounding. Maybe it was just a coincidence. After all, old-fashioned bikes weren't exactly rare. Still, I couldn't bring myself to walk past it. Instead, I took a longer route home, sticking to well-lit streets and crowded sidewalks. When I finally reached my apartment, I double-checked every lock on my doors and windows, even the ones I rarely thought about. Daisy, who had been napping on the couch, lifted her head and gave me a questioning look. Her presence comforted me, even though she seemed oblivious to my unease. That night, I woke up to a sound that made my blood run cold. It was faint at first, a soft tapping noise. I lay frozen in bed, straining to hear it. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from my living room window. Daisy began to growl, low and steady. Her ears were perked, and her eyes were fixed on the window. My apartment was on the second floor, so there was no way anyone could be tapping on it. Right, summoning every ounce of courage I had, I crept out of bed and into the living room, clutching my phone with trembling hands. The tapping stopped the moment I entered the room. The curtains were drawn, and I hesitated before pulling them back. My hand hovered over the fabric for what felt like an eternity. When I finally yanked the curtain open, my heart dropped. There was nothing there, just the empty night sky and the faint outline of the street below. I exhaled shakily, feeling equal parts relieved and foolish. Maybe I'd imagined it, or maybe it was just the wind. I tried to convince myself of that as I climbed back into bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, as I stepped outside with Daisy for her walk, I froze. There, leaning against a lamppost directly across the street from my building, was the bright blue bike. My stomach churned, and I looked around frantically, scanning the street for anyone who might have left it there. The sidewalks were empty. I decided I'd had enough. I called the police and told them everything about the masked figure back in my old town, the bike, the tapping. The officer I spoke to was polite but clearly skeptical. Still, they agreed to send a patrol car to drive by my building a few times that night. For a while, nothing else happened. I didn't see the bike again, and I started to feel like maybe the worst was behind me. Then, about 2 weeks later, I received a package in the mail with no return address. My hand shook as I opened it, dread pulling in my stomach. Inside was a single item, a crude, papier-mâché mask with exaggerated features and hollow black eyes. The note was tucked inside the mask, scrawled in messy, childlike handwriting. It read, "This May." I moved again after that, this time to a different state. I didn't tell anyone my new address except for close family, and I've avoided social media ever since. It's been over a year now, and I haven't seen the bike, the mask, or anything else out of the ordinary. But I still check my locks every night, and whenever I hear an unexpected tap at the window, my heart skips a beat. Months passed, and life at my new home started to feel normal again. I'd gotten a new job, made a couple of friends, and even started to explore the city a little. It felt like I'd left the nightmare behind, but deep down, I never truly let my guard down. The locks, the curtains, the avoidance of certain streets or times of night, it all became second nature. Then one evening, something happened that reminded me just how fragile my sense of safety was. It was a Friday night, and I had a rare evening to myself. Daisy and I were curled up on the couch, a movie playing in the background while I absent-mindedly scrolled on my phone. I wasn't paying attention at first, but Daisy started growling, softly at first, then louder, her hackles raised. I muted the TV and sat up, heart pounding. The sound of soft laughter floated into the open window. My blood ran cold. The window wasn't directly facing the street, but overlooked a small alleyway that ran between my building and the one next door. I strained to hear, praying it was just someone walking by. The laughter was faint, but it wasn't distant. It sounded like it was coming from below the window. I froze, torn between slamming the window shut and staying completely still, hoping whoever it was would move on. Daisy let out a sharp bark, her focus fixed on the window. I decided I couldn't wait. Moving as quietly as I could, I approached the window and peered out. The alley was dimly lit, but I could make out the shape of someone standing just below. They were leaning casually against the brick wall, illuminated by the faint glow of a street lamp. I couldn't see their face. It was obscured by a hat or hood, but I didn't need to see it to recognize what was leaning against the wall beside them. The bright blue bike. I stumbled back from the window, my breath catching in my throat. This couldn't be happening. I hadn't seen the bike in months. I was hundreds of miles away from where this all started. How had they found me? I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands trembling. As I explained the situation to the dispatcher, I kept my eyes on the window, terrified that the figure would try to climb up or make their way into the building. Stay on the line, the dispatcher said. Officers are on their way. Minutes felt like hours as I waited. I didn't dare move from my spot, clutching Daisy's leash in one hand and my phone in the other. Finally, I heard the distant sound of sirens. I peeked out the window again, expecting the figure to flee, but they didn't. They simply tilted their head toward the sound of the approaching police car, as if amused. The bike was gone when the officers arrived. They searched the alley and the surrounding streets but found nothing. No bike, no mask, no sign of anyone matching the description I'd given them. One of the officers assured me they'd keep an eye on the area, but I could tell they thought I was overreacting. I wasn't. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the building, every shadow cast by passing headlights set me on edge. Daisy, usually a comforting presence, was restless, pacing the apartment and growling at nothing. The next morning, I found a note taped to my door. My stomach turned as I unfolded it. The same messy handwriting stared back at me. You're fun to find. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I packed up Daisy and as much of my stuff as I could fit into my car and drove to a friend's house 2 states away. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not even my family. I deleted my social media accounts, changed my phone number, and started looking for a new place to live. It's been 6 months now, and there's been no sign of the bike, the mask, or the person behind it all. I want to believe it's over, that I've finally escaped, but I can't shake the feeling that it's only a matter of time. A few years ago, I worked as a part-time night guard at a local aquarium. It wasn't as glamorous as it sounds. Mostly, I spent the nights walking through dark hallways, checking exhibits, and making sure no one broke in. The place was eerie at night, with only the low hum of filtration systems and the occasional sound of water sloshing against the tanks. One particular night stands out. It was mid-October, and the air inside the building felt colder than usual. I started my usual rounds, flashlight in hand, stopping occasionally to peek at the tanks. The jellyfish exhibit always creeped me out, those ghostly creatures pulsing under the faint blue lights, but I had gotten used to it. As I passed the shark tunnel, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. I stopped and turned my flashlight toward the glass, half expecting to see one of the smaller sharks gliding past. Nothing. The water was still, save for the bubbles drifting upward. I shrugged it off and kept moving. About an hour later, I was in the staff area near the cafeteria, double checking the locks on the doors. That's when I heard it, a faint tapping sound. It was rhythmic, deliberate, and it seemed to be coming from the direction of the main tank, the largest one in the aquarium, home to the sea turtles, rays, and some of the larger fish. I hesitated but figured it was probably a mechanical issue or some kind of animal behavior. Still, I radioed the front desk just in case. My coworker, Carla, was stationed there for the night. Her voice crackled through the radio. Everything's quiet up here. You sure it's not just the pipes? Yeah, maybe, I replied, trying to convince myself. When I got to the main tank, the tapping had stopped. I stood there for a moment, scanning the room. The only sound was the gentle whoosh of water circulating. I was about to turn back when I noticed something strange, a handprint on the glass. It wasn't the kind of smudge you'd see from a kid pressing their hands against the tank. This was bigger. The fingers were long, almost unnaturally so, and the print was high up, too high for a person to reach without a ladder. My stomach turned. Carla, did anyone come through here today to clean the tanks or something? I asked through the radio. No, why? She responded. I told her about the handprint, but she just laughed and said I was probably imagining things. I wanted to believe her, so I wiped the glass clean with my sleeve and continued my rounds. The rest of the night was uneventful until I checked the security cameras before clocking out. Most of the footage was boring, boring, empty hallways and tanks, but then I saw something that made my blood run cold. Around the time I had been near the main tank, the camera had picked up movement. A shadow, tall and lanky, had passed in front of the tank. It wasn't a reflection, it moved independently of me, almost like it was pacing. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. I quit the job a week later. I told my manager it was because of school, but the truth is, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me during those long, lonely nights. A few weeks after I quit, I got a text from Carla. "Hey, did you hear what happened at the aquarium last night?" My heart sank. I hadn't been in contact with anyone from work since I left, so I had no idea what she was talking about. I asked her to call me, and when she did, her voice was shaky, almost frantic. "They found another handprint. Bigger this time," she said, "and something else." "What else?" I asked, dread pulling in my stomach. There was water, not just condensation, like someone splashed a bucket of it onto the floor near the main tank. But the weirdest part, the cameras went dark for about 10 minutes right before they found it. Completely black, no static, just nothing. I didn't know what to say. Carla kept going, like she needed to get it all out. One of the morning cleaners said she heard something, too, like scratching, coming from inside the tank. When she looked, there was nothing there, but she swears she felt something watching her. She's refusing to work night shifts now. I tried to calm her down, telling her it was probably just a prank or a malfunction. But deep down, I didn't believe it. I remembered that shadow, the handprint, the cold feeling that had settled in my chest every time I walked past that tank. A month later, I saw a news article about the aquarium. It had closed for renovations, though the article mentioned rumors about staff complaints and unexplained incidents. They didn't go into detail, but I knew. I thought that would be the end of it. But last week, I got a package in the mail. No return address, just a plain brown box. Inside was a Polaroid photo, the kind you don't see much anymore. It was blurry, but I could make out the shape of the main tank. In there, pressed against the glass, was another handprint. This time, it wasn't just one. There were several, overlapping, like whatever had left them was trying to claw its way out. I don't work there anymore. I don't even live in the same city, but I still keep my curtains closed at night, and I avoid aquariums altogether. For weeks after receiving that Polaroid, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. I'd see shadows flicker in the corners of my vision, hear faint tapping sounds on my apartment windows at odd hours. The paranoia was suffocating. One night, I decided I'd had enough. I was going to throw the Polaroid away, along with the box it came in. It felt like the only way to sever whatever strange connection had been lingering since I left the aquarium. As I picked up the photo, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. In the corner, faint but visible, was a reflection in the glass of the tank. It wasn't me or anyone I recognized. It was taller. Its features were distorted, but there was something undeniably humanoid about it. Long limbs, a faint shiver to its form, almost like it was wet. My heart pounded as I stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I threw the photo into the trash, slammed the lid down, and took the whole bag out to the dumpster. As I walked back inside, I told myself that was it. Whatever this was, I wasn't going to let it follow me anymore. That night, I dreamt I was back at the aquarium. The hallways were dark, and the only sound was the soft ripple of water. I walked toward the main tank, though I didn't want to. My feet moved on their own, dragging me closer. When I reached the tank, the water was black, as if it had no bottom. And then something moved. A hand, long, pale, and webbed, pressed against the glass, followed by another. Slowly, a face emerged. It was human-like but not quite right. Its eyes were large, unblinking, and glowed faintly in the dark. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. It stared at me, and though it didn't speak, I felt its voice in my head. "You saw me." I woke up gasping for air, drenched in sweat. My room was dark and silent, but the sense of dread from the dream lingered. I glanced at the clock, 3:17 a.m., and then I heard it. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from my window. I froze, too terrified to move. The sound grew louder, more insistent. I finally worked up the courage to peek through the curtain, heart hammering in my chest. There was nothing there, just the empty street below. But as I turned away, I heard it again, this time from inside the apartment. The next morning, I packed my things and left. I didn't care about breaking my lease or what my landlord would say. I needed to be somewhere far, far away. I'm writing this from a new apartment in another city, hoping that putting it all down will help me make sense of it. The Polaroid is gone, the aquarium is closed, but every now and then, I hear that faint tapping sound. I don't look anymore. I don't want to know what's there. About 10 years ago, I was a broke college student desperate for cash. I took whatever odd jobs I could find, and one of them was a temporary gig at a massive warehouse on the outskirts of town. It wasn't sketchy at first, just some late night inventory work for a week. The pay was decent, and the hours fit my schedule, so I signed up. The warehouse was enormous, with rows and rows of metal shelving stretching up toward the ceiling. During orientation, the manager, a no-nonsense woman named Carla, handed me a map and told me I'd mostly be working in the northern wing, which was less used. She stressed that we should stay in our assigned zones and not wander. When I asked why, she gave a vague response about safety protocols and liability. It seemed reasonable enough at the time. The first 2 nights were uneventful. I'd scan barcodes, check inventory, and occasionally hear the other workers chatting in the distance. The warehouse was eerily quiet, but I chalked it up to my overactive imagination. On the 3rd night, I was working alone in the northern wing when I started hearing faint tapping noises. At first, I ignored it, assuming it was just the building settling or one of the forklifts moving in the distance. But the tapping grew louder, more deliberate, like someone knocking on the metal shelving a few aisles away. I called out, thinking it might be one of my coworkers messing around. Hello, is someone there? No response. Feeling a little unnerved, I went back to work, trying to brush it off. But then, as I turned to grab a clipboard I'd set down, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, just a shadow darting across the end of the aisle. My heart started racing, but I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe one of the overhead lights flickered. I kept working, but the unease wouldn't go away. The tapping started again, this time closer. I finally decided to check it out. I walked down the aisle, scanning with my flashlight, but there was nothing there, just rows of boxes and empty shelving. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a deep, guttural voice whisper, "You're not supposed to be here." I froze. The voice came from right behind me. I whipped around, but no one was there. My flashlight beam shook as I scanned the area. At that moment, the tapping turned into a loud banging, echoing through the warehouse. It was coming from multiple directions now, surrounding me. Panic set in, and I sprinted back toward the central area where the other workers were supposed to be. But when I got there, it was empty, not a single person in sight. Even Carla's office was dark and locked. It was as if everyone had vanished. My phone had no service, and the warehouse's landline was on Carla's desk, behind a locked door. I wasn't about to stick around to find out what was going on. I grabbed my bag and ran for the exit. As I pushed through the heavy doors, I heard one final, ear-piercing scream echo from the northern wing. It wasn't human, it was distorted, like static mixed with a deep growl. I quit the next morning and never went back. After I quit, I tried to move on, convincing myself that stress or sleep deprivation had played tricks on my mind. But there were moments in the following weeks that made me doubt that explanation. First, a few coworkers reached out to ask why I had left so abruptly. I didn't want to sound crazy, so I just said it wasn't a good fit. One guy, Dave, paused for a moment and then said, "Yeah, I don't blame you. That place, it's weird. Did you ever hear the rumors about the North Wing?" I hesitated but asked what he meant. He lowered his voice, almost like he didn't want anyone else to hear. "People say they hear voices over there, see things that don't make sense. Carla doesn't talk about it, but she never lets new hires work there long. You were probably the unlucky exception." That sent a chill through me, but I still tried to brush it off. Maybe the rumors had gotten to me, and my imagination had filled in the gaps. Then, about a month after I quit, I ran into Carla herself at a local coffee shop. I tried to avoid her, but she spotted me and waved me over. She asked how I was doing and if I'd found another job. I gave her polite answers, but she could tell I was uncomfortable. After a pause, she leaned in and said, "I don't blame you for leaving. Honestly, I try not to stay late myself. It's safer that way." I didn't know what to say. Her face was serious, and there was something haunted in her eyes. I managed to stammer, "What do you mean by that?" Carla sighed, glancing around as if someone might overhear. "Let's just say, some things don't stay in the past." That fire left more than scars on the building. She gave me a tight smile and walked away before I could ask anything else. That was the last time I ever saw or heard from anyone connected to the warehouse. I've since moved to another city and have a completely different job, but sometimes, late at night, I think about the voice I heard, the scream, the shadow. For a while, I avoided talking about the warehouse altogether. Every time I thought about it, that guttural voice and the shadow flickering at the edge of my vision haunted me. But then, about 6 months later, I received an email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line read, "About the Northern Wing." My stomach dropped as I debated whether to open it. Against my better judgment, I clicked. The email was short, but it sent a chill down my spine. "Hi, I hope this finds you well. You don't know me, but I worked at the warehouse a few years back. I heard from a mutual acquaintance that you had some unusual experiences there. If that's true, you're not alone. I've been trying to piece together what's really really going on. I've spoken to others who work there, and there's a pattern, voices, shadows, and always in the northern wing. People quit, just like you, and no one talks about it. The company keeps it quiet. If you're willing to talk, I think we might be able to figure out what's happening. Please let me know. Best, Sam. I didn't reply right away. Something about the email felt wrong, like reopening a door I'd worked hard to close. But curiosity got the better of me, and a week later, I sent a cautious response, asking what Sam had found. His reply came quickly and included a chilling detail I hadn't shared with anyone. I heard the same thing you did, he wrote, a voice that says, "You're not supposed to be here." Did it sound like it was right behind you? I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. There was no way he could have known that. I hadn't told anyone about the exact words or how close it felt. Sam went on to explain that he'd been researching the history of the warehouse. It turned out the fire wasn't the only tragedy tied to the place. Before it was a warehouse, the building had been a factory. In the early 1900 seconds, several workers had died in a collapse caused by poor safety standards. Those who survived claimed they heard cries for help echoing through the rubble for days after the accident, even when they were certain no one else was alive. He attached an old newspaper clipping about the collapse. It mentioned a worker named Andrew who had been found crushed under a beam. Witnesses claimed that, in his final moments, he kept repeating, "You're not supposed to be here," over and over as if he was warning someone. The story gave me chills. Sam wanted to meet in person, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Something about digging deeper felt dangerous, like whatever was in that building might not appreciate the attention. I told him I was sorry, but I couldn't get involved anymore. He didn't push me, but his last email stuck with me. "If you ever change your mind, let me know. Just be careful. Whatever it is, it doesn't like intruders." A few months later, I heard through the grapevine that the warehouse had closed permanently. Officially, it was due to structural issues, but part of me wonders if it was something else. Something the company finally decided wasn't worth the risk. I've never gone back, and I never will. My job was mainly digitizing old documents, faded photos, handwritten ledgers, and letters donated by families in the area. The society rented out the bottom floor of an old bank building, the kind with high ceilings and decorative crown moldings. My workspace was in a cramped back room that housed our archive vault. The vault wasn't what you'd imagine, no dramatic spinning lock or piles of gold coins. It was a reinforced room where they stored fragile paper records and temperature-controlled cabinets. It had one heavy metal door, which always gave me the creeps because it locked automatically if it closed all the way. One afternoon, I was cataloging some 1920s school attendance records. The vault was unusually warm that day, and I was annoyed because the HVAC system controlling the humidity had been acting up all week. I left the vault door slightly ajar, propping it with a thick binder. I had been working for about an hour when I heard it, a soft, steady tapping like fingernails on glass. I froze, my hands hovering over a stack of documents. The tapping came again, rhythmic and deliberate. It wasn't loud, but it sounded close. The vault didn't have windows. In fact, there weren't any windows in the back half of the building. My immediate thought was that someone had gotten in, though that didn't make sense. The only way into the vault was through the main room, and the front desk staff would have seen anyone come in. I tried to shake it off and focus on my work, convincing myself it was just a weird mechanical noise. But then the tapping moved. It started behind me, then shifted to my right, and then directly in front of me on the other side of the steel cabinet I was using as a desk. "Hello," I called out, my voice cracking a little. The tapping stopped. I waited, straining to hear anything over the hum of the air conditioning. Then, just as I started to convince myself it had been my imagination, I heard a soft laugh, a woman's laugh. But it wasn't warm or friendly, it was thin, brittle, like it was missing some essential piece of humanity. I shot up from my chair, knocking over a stack of papers. "Who's there?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. The room was silent, but I swear I could feel someone watching me. I backed toward the door, ready to bolt, but as I reached for the door handle, I realized the binder I'd used to prop it open was gone. The door was closed, almost completely, just enough for the lock not to engage. I hadn't heard it move. Heart racing, I grabbed the handle and yanked the door open. I stumbled out into the main room, where my coworker Jenny was sitting at her desk, scrolling through her phone. She looked up, startled. "You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost," she said. I didn't answer. I just gestured toward the vault and muttered, "Someone's in there." Jenny frowned and followed me back. Together, we checked every corner of the vault. Nothing. No sign of anyone. No binder. No explanation for the tapping or the laugh. The next day, the maintenance guy found the binder inside one of the sealed cabinets. He swore up and down that it would have been impossible for it to get in there without someone opening the cabinet manually. A few weeks after I quit, I couldn't shake the lingering unease. Something about that experience felt unfinished. I told myself it was just a coincidence, just an overactive imagination amplified by the isolation of working alone. But I'd also heard whispers from other employees about the vault before I left, stories they'd laughed off as small town gossip. Now I wondered if there was more to that yet. One one evening, after too much wine and a little too much courage, I decided to do some digging. The Historical Society kept its own records, so I knew where to look. I still had a key to the building. Janine had forgotten to collect it, and I used it to let myself in late that night. The place was unsettlingly quiet without the buzz of daytime activity. I felt like an intruder, even though I technically still had access. I went straight to the records room, flipping through files related to the building itself. Most of it was dry: blueprints, old photographs, a few notes on its history as a bank. Then I found something that made my blood run cold: a newspaper clipping from the 1930s. It was about a woman named Eliza Pritchard, a bank employee who had gone missing. The article speculated that she had stolen a large sum of money before disappearing. Her coworkers had claimed she was acting strangely in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, hearing things no one else could and accusing others of watching her. She was never found. I sat there, staring at the grainy black and white photo of Eliza. Her face was blurred, but her eyes seemed to follow me. The article mentioned that she had last been seen in the bank's vault, the very vault where I had heard that laugh. I tried to shake off the chill creeping up my spine. Maybe it was all just a coincidence, I told myself. But as I was about to close the folder, I noticed a handwritten note tucked behind the clipping. It wasn't dated, but the handwriting looked much more recent. It read, "The tapping started again. I hear her laughing at night. I don't think she ever left." I left the file exactly as I'd found it, my heart pounding. As I locked the building behind me, I swore I'd never set foot in there again. But here's the thing, it didn't stop. Even after I quit, I'd wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I could hear that same brittle laugh echoing in my head. Sometimes, I'd hear fate tapping at my bedroom window, even though I lived on the second floor. I've moved twice since then, but every now and then, I still feel it, the sensation of someone watching me, just out of sight. It's always worse at night, when everything is quiet. I don't know what Eliza wanted, or why she chose me, but I can't shake the feeling that I accidentally let something out of that vault. And if that's the case, I hope to God she never finds me. I wish I could tell you that after moving twice, things got better, that the strange sensations, the tapping, and the inexplicable laughter faded over time. But they didn't. If anything, they grew stronger. A few months ago, I was staying late at my new job, sorting through old company records in yet another dimly lit office building. I hadn't told anyone about my experience with the vault. I didn't want to sound unhinged. But late that night, as I sat alone under flickery fluorescent lights, I heard it again, the faint, rhythmic tapping. I froze, my pen hovering over a stack of papers. My rational brain tried to come up with an explanation. Maybe the HVAC system was acting up, or a tree branch was brushing against a window. But deep down, I knew better. It was the same tapping, the same pattern I'd heard back in the vault. I tried to ignore it, focusing on my work, but the sound grew louder. It started behind me, then shifted to my left. Then it stopped, replaced by the familiar brittle laugh. Not again, I whispered to myself, trying to keep calm. I grabbed my bag and practically ran out of the office, leaving the lights on behind me. I didn't even bother locking up. I just needed to get out. The walk to my car felt like a nail. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward me. Every rustling leaf sounded like footsteps. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. When I finally reached my car, I jumped in and locked the doors, breathing hard. I turned on the engine, and the headlights illuminated the empty parking lot. Empty, except for a faint figure standing at the far end. A woman. She was too far away to make out her features, but I could tell she was wearing something old-fashioned, like a dress from another era. She didn't move, didn't approach, just stood there, watching me. I didn't wait to find out who or what she was. I hit the gas and sped out of the lot, my heart racing. When I glanced in the rearview mirror, she was gone. After that night, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I started researching everything I could about Eliza Pritchard. I wanted to believe she was just a tragic figure tied to that old bank, but the more I read, the more I realized she was different. Her name popped up in strange places. A worker at a post office in the 1950s claimed to have seen her reflection in a locked glass case. A security guard in the 1970s quit his job after hearing her laugh in a dark storage room. I wasn't the first person she'd followed, and I don't think I'll be the last. I've started sleepy with the lights on, though it doesn't help much. The tapping still comes sometimes, faint but unmistakable, always in the quiet hours before dawn. I've tried ignoring it, but it's hard when I know she's there, just out of sight. A part of me wonders if acknowledging her was my mistake. Maybe that's how she latches on, feeding off fear and attention. But it's too late for me now. If you're ever in a quiet place, late at night, and you hear soft tapping, don't respond. Don't call out, don't investigate, and whatever you do, don't laugh back. Last summer, I went to an estate sale on a whim. It was held at an old brick house just outside town. Nothing extraordinary, but large enough to pique curiosity about what treasures might be hidden inside. I'm not a collector of anything in particular, but I love the odd knick-knack, and there was a buzz around town about the mysterious collection the owners had left behind. The sale was well organized. Each room in the house had tables arranged with items for sale. The living room was filled with books, the kitchen with vintage cookware, and the bedroom displayed an array of antique jewelry and clothing. But it was the dining room that drew me in. There, propped on an easel, was a large oil portrait of a woman. She looked like she was from the 1920s, with her dark bob hair and a string of pearls that seemed to gleam against the deep green of her dress. Her eyes were striking, piercing, like she was staring right through you. I couldn't tell if it was the skill of the artist or just an optical illusion, but her gaze followed you no matter where you stood. I don't know why I bought it. I'm not usually into portraits, especially not ones that stare you down, but something about it felt magnetic. The price was ridiculously low, almost as if they wanted to get rid of it. I paid in cash and brought it home that same afternoon. At first, it was just a conversation piece. My friends joked about how haunted it looked, and I laughed along, though part of me wondered if they were right. After a few days, though, things started to feel off. I'd hear faint sounds in the night, like soft footsteps crossing the hardwood floors, but I live alone. My cat, Milo, who is usually fearless, started avoiding the dining room where I hung the portrait. He'd hiss at the doorway if I tried to bring him near it. Then, I started waking up in the middle of the night, always at 3:13 a.m. at first. I thought it was just stress, but it became a pattern. Each time, I'd feel this strange pull to go to the dining room. I can't explain it. It was like an urge that wasn't mine. The first few nights, I resisted, but on the fourth night, curiosity won out. I stepped into the room, and for the first time, I noticed something strange about the portrait. Her expression had changed. The soft, neutral smile she'd had before was now slightly upturned, almost smug. I told myself I was imagining it, paranoia brought on by sleepless nights. But the next night, the footsteps grew louder. This time, they didn't stop. They crossed the hallway, entered my room, and stopped right beside my bed. I froze, too scared to even open my eyes, though I felt the unmistakable sensation of someone leaning over me. I could hear breathing, low and slow, inches from my face. The next morning, I decided the painting had to go. I carried it down to the basement, covered it with a sheet, and shut the door. That night, I slept with all the lights on, but it didn't help. At exactly 3:13 a.m., I woke up to the sound of breaking glass. I ran downstairs, heart pounding, and found the portrait back in the dining room. The glass over the frame shattered on the floor. The woman's expression had changed again. This time, she wasn't smiling at all. Her lips were pressed tightly together, and her eyes, God, her eyes looked angry. I didn't think. I grabbed the portrait, ran outside, and drove to the nearest dumpster I could find. I didn't care about the late hour or how crazy I must have looked. I threw it in, climbed back into my car, and didn't look back. Life started to feel normal again after I got rid of the portrait. A few weeks passed, and I convinced myself that whatever had been happening was just my overactive imagination. But then, something happened that brought the fear rushing back. It started small. A package arrived at my door one afternoon with no return address. I assumed it was a delivery mix-up, but when I opened it, my stomach dropped. Inside was a photo of the portrait, just the woman's face, cut out from what looked like an old photograph. Her expression was different yet again. This time, her eyes seemed wider, almost manic, and her lips curled in a mocking smirk. I threw the photo away immediately, but I couldn't shake the unease. Who had sent it? How did they know about the painting? And why would anyone go out of their way to send me something like that? That night, I double-checked all the locks in my house before going to bed. Milo was unusually clingy, curling up beside me and refusing to leave my side. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just a weird prank. But at 3:13 a.m., I woke up again. This time, it wasn't the sound of footsteps or breaking glass. It was the distinct feeling of pressure on my chest, like something heavy was sitting on me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, and when I opened my eyes, I saw her. The woman from the portrait was there, sitting on the edge of my bed, her face inches from mine. Her eyes were wide and unblinking, and her lips were twisted into a cruel smile. She didn't say anything, but I felt an overwhelming sense of malice radiating from her. I don't know how long I was frozen like that, seconds, minutes. It felt like an eternity, and then, just as suddenly as she appeared, she was gone. The weight lifted, and I could move again. Milo was nowhere to be seen, but I could hear him hissing and growling from somewhere in the house. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I packed a bag and left. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I just drove until I found a cheap motel a few towns over. I stayed there for a week, trying to figure out what to do. Part of me wanted to believe it was all in my head, but the fear was too real to ignore. When I finally returned home, the house felt different. The air was heavier, and the shadows seemed darker. Milo wouldn't come inside, no matter how much I coaxed him. I spent that first night on the couch, too scared to sleep in my bedroom. And, of course, at 3:13 a.m., I woke up again. This time, I heard a faint tapping sound coming from the basement. It was slow and rhythmic, like someone lightly knocking on the walls. My heart raced as I crept down the stairs, armed with nothing but my phone flashlight. The tapping grew louder as I approached the basement door. When I opened it, the tapping stopped. I hesitated at the top of the stairs, shining the light into the darkness below, and that's when I saw it. The portrait was back. It was sitting in the middle of the basement floor, completely uncovered, and the woman's face was different yet again. Her eyes were fixed on me, her smile wide and malicious. Written across the canvas, in what looked like deep red paint, were the words, "You can't get rid of me." I slammed the door and ran out of the house, not stopping until I was back in my car. I don't remember much of the drive, but I ended up at a friend's house across town. I told them everything, and they didn't hesitate to let me stay. That was 6 months ago. I haven't been back to the house since. I put it on the market, but so far, no one's shown much interest. I don't blame them, and even just thinking about that place makes my skin crawl. As for the portrait, I don't know how it found its way back, and I don't want to know. All I can hope is that whoever ends up buying the house doesn't find it. I tried to move on, and I rented a small apartment on the other side of town and filled it with light, lamps, candles, anything to keep the dark corners at bay. Milo adjusted quickly and seemed happier there, which gave me some relief. I even started therapy, hoping to rationalize the fear that still gripped me. But deep down, I knew this wasn't something therapy could fix. About a month after I moved, I received a call from my real estate agent. They were excited. They'd found a buyer for the house, someone who didn't seem deterred by the old brick exterior or the slightly eerie atmosphere. I felt a rush of relief. If the house was sold, maybe I could finally close this chapter of my life. But then the agent mentioned something odd. When I did the final walkthrough, I noticed an old painting in the basement. They said, "I thought you cleared everything out." My stomach dropped. "Hi, I don't remember leaving anything behind." I stammered, my voice barely steady. "What did it look like?" "It's just a portrait of a woman," they replied casually. "A little creepy, honestly. Her eyes follow you around the room." I was going to get rid of it, but the buyer saw it and said they wanted to keep it. Said it adds character to the house. I couldn't breathe. My mind raced with images of the woman's ever-changing expressions, her piercing eyes, and that chilly message scrawled across the canvas. "Can you describe her expression?" I finally asked, my voice trembling. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Now that you mention it, it's strange. I could swear she was smiling before, but today she looks angry, almost like she's glaring at me." I didn't say anything. I couldn't. My throat felt like it was closing up. "Anyway, it's not my problem anymore," the agent said with a nervous laugh. The buyer insisted on keeping it. "So you're officially off the hook. Congratulations." I hung up without saying goodbye. The relief I'd felt earlier was gone, replaced by a gnawing sense of dread. I told myself it was over, the house and the painting were someone else's problem now. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. 2 weeks later, I woke up to a voicemail from an unknown number. The message was garbled, filled with static and distant echoes, but I could just make out a few words. "Why did you leave me?" The voice was female, cold and accusatory, and it sent a chill down my spine. I blocked the number, but the calls didn't stop. They came at all hours, sometimes with nothing but heavy breathing, other times with that same chilly voice repeating the question, "Why did you leave me?" I changed my number. It didn't help. The calls kept coming. Then, one night, I came home from work to find my front door slightly ajar. My heart pounded as I stepped inside, clutching my keys like a weapon. The apartment was eerily quiet, and everything looked normal until I stepped into the living room. The portrait was there, leaning against the wall. The woman's face was twisted into an expression of pure rage. Her eyes burned with malice, and her mouth was open in a silent scream. I ran out of the apartment. It didn't stop until I was in my car, Milo clutched tightly in my arms. I didn't know where to go, but I couldn't stay there. I drove aimlessly for hours, eventually pulling into the parking lot of an all-night diner. I sat there, shaking, trying to figure out what to do. I ended up calling the only person I could think of, my friend Kate, the one who let me stay with her after the first incident. She didn't hesitate to let me crash at her place again. But when I arrived, Milo's still in tow. I couldn't bring myself to tell her the full story. I just said there had been a break-in and left it at that. The portrait didn't follow me to Kate's, at least not physically, but the dream started that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the woman's face. Sometimes she was smiling, sometimes screaming, sometimes staring at me with that same accusatory glare. No matter how much I tried to shake it off, I woke up at 3:13 a.m. every single night, drenched in sweat and gasping for air. It's been 3 months since the portrait showed up in my apartment. I haven't been back there, and I don't plan to, but the calls and the dreams haven't stopped. Every so often, I wake up with the feeling that someone is standing over me, watching, waiting. I've thought about going back to the house, about confronting whatever this is, but I'm terrified of what I might find. For now, I'm just trying to keep moving, keep running, but deep down, I know I can't run forever. I was working late in an office building downtown. The place had its own multi-level parking garage with one of those little booths where an attendant would sit during the day to collect parking fees. That night, the booth was usually empty. Employees could leave with their key cards. It was almost midnight when I finally left the building. My car was on the 3rd floor of the garage, and the place was eerily silent except for the occasional hum of a flickering fluorescent light. As I approached the stairs, I noticed the light in the parking booth was on, which struck me as odd. The booth was always empty at this hour. Out of curiosity, I glanced in as I passed. A man was sitting inside, hunched over the counter, scribbling furiously on a pad of paper. He wore a crisp white shirt and a dark vest that looked like it belonged to a ballet from decades ago. He didn't acknowledge me, and I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe the building had hired someone to keep an eye on things after hours. When I got to my car, I realized I'd forgotten my phone on my desk. Annoyed, I decided to run back upstairs to grab it. On my way back down, I noticed the booth light was off, and it looked empty again. I slowed as I passed, peering inside to confirm. The man was gone, but the pad of paper was still on the counter, a pen resting on top. Something about it felt wrong. I don't know why, but I felt compelled to look at the pad. I hesitated, debating whether to just leave, but my curiosity got the better of me. I opened the booth door and flipped through the pages. They were filled with names, dozens, maybe hundreds of them, written in the same neat, deliberate handwriting. On the last page, my name was written at the very bottom. The sound of footsteps echoed from the stairwell behind me. My heart froze. I turned, but the stairs were empty. I sprinted to my car and sped out of the garage without looking back. I didn't stop until I was halfway home. That night, I couldn't sleep. The memory of that man and my name on the pad haunted me. The next day, I asked the building manager about the booth. He seemed confused and told me no one had been hired to work nights, and the booth hadn't been used in years. I checked the garage myself after work that evening, but the booth was dark and empty. The pad of paper was gone. A few weeks after that night, I began noticing strange things. It started small. Misplaced items in my apartment, like my keys or wallet being in spots I was certain I hadn't left them. At first, I chalked it up to stress. After all, the incident in the parking lot had left me rattled, and I figured my mind was playing tricks on me. But then, it escalated. One evening, I came home to find a sticky note on my kitchen counter. It wasn't mine. The paper was the same cheap kind they used in office supply closets, and the handwriting was eerily familiar, neat, deliberate, the same as the names in the pad from the booth. The note simply said, "See you soon." My stomach dropped. I checked all the doors and windows, but everything was locked. No signs of a break-in. I told myself it must have been a prank, though I had no idea how anyone could have gotten inside. Over the next few nights, I started hearing noises. At first, it was faint, scratches on the walls, a soft tap 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 on the window in the living room. But I lived on the 3rd floor of an apartment building. No tree branches or stray animals could reach up that high. One night, I woke up to the sound of my front door handle jiggling. I froze in bed, straining to hear. A moment later, there was a soft knock, 3 slow, deliberate taps. I grabbed my phone and called the police, whispering my address and begging them to hurry. When the officers arrived, they found nothing. No one in the hallways, no signs of forced entry. They assured me it was probably a one-off incident, maybe a prank by a neighbor or a misunderstanding. But I knew better. The next morning, I found another note slipped under my door. Don't bother. I was done. I packed a bag and drove to a friend's house across town, too afraid to spend another night in my apartment. My friend, Amanda, was sympathetic but skeptical. She thought I was overreacting, that it was likely just someone messing with me. That night at her place, I felt a small measure of relief. I locked all the doors and windows, double-checked them twice. Amanda and I stayed up late watching movies, trying to take my mind off everything. Around 2 a.m., Amanda's phone buzzed. She frowned, then held it up for me to see. It was a text from an unknown number. Let her know I can still see her. My blood ran cold. Amanda's apartment was on the 5th floor, and we hadn't told anyone I was there. We called the police again, but just like before, they found nothing. No sign of a break-in, no evidence of anyone nearby. The number that texted Amanda led to a burner phone, untraceable. I left town the next day. I didn't even go back to my apartment to get my things. I just paid my landlord to clear it out. I moved halfway across the country, changed my number, deleted all my social media. For a while, I thought it worked, but last week, I got a package at my new place. No return address, just my name written on the front and that same familiar handwriting. I debated throwing it out, but curiosity got the better of me. Inside was a single sheet of paper. You can't run forever. I haven't slept since. The package was the last straw. I was beyond terrified and utterly exhausted. I knew I couldn't keep running, but I also couldn't let this consume me. I had to figure out who or what was doing this to me. I decided to go back to the beginning, the parking garage. Armed with a flashlight and a canister of pepper spray, I returned to the city late one evening. I felt foolish even stepping foot into the same garage, but I was desperate for answers. The place looked exactly as I remembered, dark, empty, and humming with that eerie fluorescent glow. The booth was still there, its glass smudged and the inside empty. I opened the door cautiously, half expecting to see the man from that night sitting there, scribbling away. But there was nothing, not even the pad of paper. I shone my flashlight around, scanning every corner, every surface. Then I noticed something odd. The back wall of the booth, which I thought was solid, had a faint outline, a seam that suggested a hidden door. My heart raced as I pressed against it. The door gave way with a soft creak, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the darkness. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but I forced myself forward. The air grew colder and heavier with each step. At the bottom of the stairs was a small, windowless room. It was dimly lit by a single hanging bulb, and the walls were lined with filing cabinets. In the center of the room was a table, and on it sat the pad of paper. I approached slowly, my hands trembling. The pad was open, and the pages were filled with more names that didn't seem to end. I flipped through them until I reached the last page. There was my name again, circled this time, with 2 words scrawled underneath. Final step. A sound behind me made me whip around. The stairs creaked as if someone, or something, was coming down. My flashlight beam darted across the room, but there was nothing there. Still, the creaking continued, closer and closer. I backed up against the wall, clutching my pepper spray, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. Then the light bulb flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. I don't know how, but I found the courage, or maybe the desperation, to make a break for it. I sprinted blindly toward where I thought the stairs were, my shoulders slamming into walls and my flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. I made it up the stairs and burst into the open air of the parking garage, gasping and shaking. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I tore out of the garage and drove straight to the nearest police station. I tried explaining what I'd found, but I could tell they didn't take me seriously. A hidden room in a parking garage. A mysterious man with a pad of names. It sounded crazy even to me. When they finally agreed to check it out, I went with them, desperate to show them I wasn't imagining things. But when we returned to the garage, the booth was gone. Not just empty, the entire structure had been removed, as if it had never been there at all. The officers gave me a sympathetic but skeptical look before leaving. I don't know who or what is behind this. I don't know how they knew where I was, how they removed that booth so quickly, or what the room and the names mean. But I do know one thing. I haven't seen the last of them, and I fear next time it'll truly be my final stop. A couple of years ago, I enrolled in a night class at a local university. It was a philosophy course that met in one of those huge, tiered lecture halls. The class was packed, but for some reason, I always ended up sitting in the same seat near the back, 3rd row from the top. It wasn't assigned, but it became my spot. One night, I arrived later than usual, and the only seat left was directly in the center of the very last row. It felt oddly isolated back there, but I didn't have much choice. The professor's voice echoed faintly, as if I was listening to him through a tunnel, and I felt strangely disconnected from the rest of the class. About halfway through the lecture, I felt a sudden chill crawl up my spine. It wasn't the air conditioning, it felt deliberate, like someone had pressed icy fingers along my neck. I glanced to my left and right, but the row was empty on either side of me. I tried to shake it off and refocus on the professor, but out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a shadow moving along the wall behind me. It didn't match the movements of anyone in the room. When I turned to look directly at it, there was nothing there, just a blank white wall and the faint hum of fluorescent lights. After that, I couldn't focus. I started feeling like someone or something was watching me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but the only thing behind me was the wall and a small, locked maintenance door labeled authorized personnel only. It wasn't the kind of door anyone would casually use during a class, and it didn't look like it had been opened in years. I brushed it off as nerds or maybe exhaustion. The lecture eventually ended, and I filed out with the rest of the students. As I reached the exit, I turned back to glance at my row one last time. That's when I saw it. There, in the seat I had been sitting in, was a figure figure, not a person, not really. It was more like an outline of a person, a faint, flickering silhouette that didn't seem quite solid. It was sitting perfectly still, facing the front of the room. My heart raced as I stared, frozen in place. It didn't turn to look at me, but I swear I felt it notice me. The longer I looked, the more I could make out vague details, a shape that was wrong, proportions that didn't make sense. I blinked, and it was gone. I left in a hurry and tried to convince myself I was just tired, but I avoided that back row from then on, even if it meant sitting on the floor. A few weeks later, I'd overheard some classmates talking about the shadow in the back row. One girl swore she saw it too, a dark shape sitting perfectly still in one of the seats. Another guy chimed in, saying he'd heard rumors that years ago, a janitor had locked himself in that maintenance room and, well, he never made it out. I dropped the class shortly after that. A few months after dropping the class, I mostly forgot about the incident. Life moved on, and I chalked the experience up to stress, overactive imagination, or a strange coincidence. But deep down, there was always a nagging feeling that what I saw wasn't just in my head. One evening, I ran into a former classmate, Julia, at a coffee shop. She had also taken the philosophy course and immediately recognized me. "Hey, did you ever finish that class?" she asked, stirring her drink. I shook my head. "No, I dropped it. That lecture hall creeped me out." Her expression shifted, becoming serious. "Yeah, I don't blame you. Something wasn't right in there." I leaned in, subtly curious. "Did you ever say anything weird?" Julia hesitated, then nodded. "Not exactly what you'd call weird, more like unsettling. I kept hearing footsteps in the back row when no one was sitting there. Sometimes I'd feel like someone was standing right behind me, even though I was in the middle of a crowded row. It got so bad I stopped going to class entirely." I told her about the shadowy figure I had seen in the maintenance door in the back. Her face went pale. "You're not the only one," she said quietly. "Apparently, that door used to lead to a storage closet, but after they renovated the building, it got sealed up. No one knows why, but students who sit in the back row keep complaining about things, feeling watched, cold spots, shadows that don't belong." She glanced around the coffee shop nervously, as though afraid someone might overhear. "There's this story going around. Back in the 82nds, a professor went missing. He was one of those eccentric types who spent way too much time on campus. The rumor is that he went into that closet one night and never came out. Some students think he is still there, or maybe what's left of him is." I laughed nervously, but the uneasy feeling crept back into my chest. Julia continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "They say if you sit in the back row alone, especially near that door, you might feel him. And if you do, don't turn around. If you look at him, he notices you." Her words brought me back to that night in the lecture hall. The way I had felt the figure notice me without it even turning. A shiver ran down my spine. "I think I did look," I admitted, my voice barely audible. "I saw something." Julia's eyes widened. She reached across the table and grabbed my hand. "You should stay away from that building. Just don't go back." I didn't need convincing, but what she said next left me even more shaken. "You know how they have security cameras in the lecture halls now?" she asked. "My friend works in the tech department and had to pull footage from that room once. He swore there was something on the tape, something sitting in the back row. He said the chairs moved, like someone was getting up and walking out. But when he rewound the footage, the rows were empty the entire time." I didn't sleep much that night. Months later, I drove past the university campus on my way home from work. As I glanced at the building where the lecture hall was, I couldn't help but feel like it was watching me. I turned my eyes back to the road, gripped the steering wheel tightly, and drove faster. Months turned into years, and I had successfully moved on with my life, or so I thought. I hadn't stepped foot near that university, let alone the lecture hall, but the memories occasionally crept back, uninvited. The shadow, the chill, the stories, they had settled somewhere in the back of my mind like a faint itch I couldn't scratch. It wasn't until last year that I started to feel like it wasn't just in my head anymore. I had been working at a new job for about a year, a standard office gig that required a lot of late nights. The building was fairly modern, all glass and steel, with wide open workspaces and brightly lit conference rooms. But even in such a clean, professional environment, I started noticing odd things. At first, it was small. Papers left on my desk would be slightly out of place, even though I was meticulous about organizing my workspace. My office chair, which I always pushed in, would sometimes be slightly turned or pulled back when I returned from a quick break. I chalked it up to forgetfulness or an overzealous cleaner. Then, one night, I was working late, alone. The office was completely silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. I had headphones on, lost in a spreadsheet, when I felt it, that same chill, sharp and deliberate, crawling up my neck. I froze, my hands hovering above the keyboard. Slowly, I turned in my chair. The office was empty, just rows of darkened desks and monitors, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I tried to laugh it off and went back to work, but the feeling wouldn't go away. Every so often, I would catch movement in my peripheral vision, a shadow flitting past a cubicle, something shifting near the far wall. Each time I turned to look, there was nothing there. It was nearly midnight when I finally decided to pack up and leave. As I grabbed my bag and stood up, I heard a faint scraping sound like a chair being pushed back. My heart pounded as I scanned the room. All the chairs were empty, neatly tucked under their desks. I told myself it was just the building settling or the HVAC system kicking on. But then, as I turned toward the elevator, I saw it. In the reflection of the glass wall separating the office from the hallway, there was a figure standing behind me. Dark, flickering, and impossibly still, just like the one I had seen in the lecture hall years ago. My breath caught in my throat as I spun around, but the space behind me was empty. The reflection was gone too. I didn't take the elevator. I ran down the stairs, all 15 flights, and didn't stop until I was outside in the cool night air. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, just out of sight. The next morning, I emailed my boss and told them I wasn't feeling well. I stayed home for a week, trying to convince myself that it was just stress or a lack of sleep. But when I finally returned to the office, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. On my desk, right in the center of my keyboard, was a single piece of paper. It wasn't mine, and I hadn't left it there. It was blank, except for one thing, a small, hand-drawn door in the center of the page. It was unmistakably the same door I had seen in the lecture hall all those years ago. I quit that job a week later and moved to a different city. I've done everything I could to leave the past behind me, but every now and then, I still feel it, that faint, icy chill, that sense of being watched. And sometimes, when I glance into a reflective surface, I catch a glimpse of something dark and flickering, just for a moment. About 3 years ago, I moved to a smaller city for work. The place had a quaint charm, brick buildings, cobblestone streets, and a bustling arts community. I wasn't much of an artist myself, but I loved exploring the murals that dotted the city. Each one seemed alive, filled with personality, stories, and vibrant colors. One mural, in particular, caught my attention on my way home from work. It was tucked away in a narrow alley between two old buildings, a stunning piece of art depicting a sprawling tree with its branches stretching into the sky, each one painted with surreal detail. Tiny figures lived among the branches, children playing, birds singing, even what looked like miniature houses carved into the bark. It felt like a storybook brought to life. I made a habit of stopping by that alley to admire the mural. It was always there, waiting for me like an old friend. One Friday evening, as I passed the alley, I noticed something odd. The mural wasn't quite the same. A new figure had appeared, an unfamiliar silhouette standing under the tree, barely noticeable but undeniably there. The figure was shadowy, almost blending into the background. I assumed it was an artist adding to the piece and thought nothing of it. The next day, curiosity got the better of me and I returned to the alley. The figure was still there, but it had changed position. Now it was further up the tree, standing on one of the branches, gazing down at the figures below. Its form seemed sharper, more defined, as if someone had painted it overnight. I asked around at a nearby coffee shop if anyone knew the artist behind the mural. The barista just shrugged and said the mural had been there for years, untouched as far as she knew. By Sunday, the figure had moved again, this time higher into the branches. It was unsettling now, too human in shape, almost as if it were watching me. I told myself it was just my imagination, but a gnawing unease settled in my stomach. That night, I had a vivid dream. I was standing in the alley, staring at the mural. The shadowy figure turned its head to look directly at me. Its eyes were hollow, black voids, and yet I couldn't look away. Slowly, it began climbing down the tree, its limbs stretching unnaturally, its movements too fluid to belong to anything human. I woke up in a cold sweat. I avoided the alley the next day. By Monday evening, my curiosity got the better of me, and I convinced myself to take one more look. As I turned the corner into the alley, my heart stopped. The mural was blank. No tree, no tiny figures, no shadowy silhouette. Just a plain, crumbly wall. I stood there, confused and terrified. I hadn't imagined it. I couldn't have. I visited that mural almost every day for weeks. As I stood frozen, a voice broke through my thoughts. Admiring the well. It was a man, middle-aged, wearing a janitor's uniform. He must have been coming out of a side door in the building. There was a mural here, I stammered. A tree with figures on the branches. The man gave me a puzzled look. There's never been a mural here. This wall's been bare for years. I didn't argue. I just walked away, my skin crawling. A few days later, I moved out of the city for unrelated reasons, but I've never stopped thinking about that mural, or what it might have meant. Did I imagine it? Did it somehow imagine me? After I moved, I tried to let the memory of the mural fade into the background. Life went on, and I convinced myself that maybe I'd been overworked or sleep deprived back then, and my mind had played tricks on me. me. But the story didn't end there. About 6 months after leaving the city, I got a call from an old coworker who still lived there. We caught up for a bit, and then, as casually as you might mention the weather, he asked, "Hey, did you ever see that creepy alley mural near your old apartment?" My stomach dropped. "What are you talking about?" I asked, trying to sound calm. "You know, the one with the tree and all the little people in it. I never noticed it until a couple of weeks ago. It's weird. I'm surprised you didn't mention it while you were here." I didn't respond right away. He went on, describing the mural exactly as I'd seen it, except now, the shadowy figure was sitting on one of the branches, legs dangling over the edge. I stammered out some vague response, something like, "Yeah, I think I saw it once or twice." After we hung up, I sat staring at my phone, a chill creeping up my spine. Why was the mural back? Why hadn't anyone else noticed it before? And why was it changing? I couldn't resist the pull to learn more. Over the next few weeks, I scoured forums and social media looking for any mention of the mural. At first, I found nothing, but eventually, I stumbled upon a thread in a local urban legends group. Someone had posted a grainy photo of the mural, the tree, the figures, and yes, the shadowy figure sitting on the branch. The caption read, "Anyone else seen this? It's in an alley off 12th Street. Freaks me out." The comments were a mix of people dismissing it as graffiti and others saying they'd noticed it too. One comment, however, stood out. "If you see it, don't stare for too long. It watches back." I clicked on the commenter's profile, but it had been deleted. My heart was racing now. Against my better judgment, I messaged the original poster and asked if they'd noticed anything strange about the mural. They replied quickly, "Yeah, the figure moves. My friend said it wasn't there last year, but now it's all over the tree. I swear it's closer every time I look. Gonna stay away from it. Something feels off." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept picturing the shadowy figure, wondering how it could move, what it was, and why it seemed to appear and disappear at will. Worse, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a figure in a painting, that somehow it was more aware than it should have been. Then, the dream started again. I'd find myself back in that alley, standing before the mural. The figure would always be there, climbing down the branches, getting closer and closer. Sometimes it whispered, but I could never make out the words. Other times, it simply stared at me, its hollow eyes unblinking. The final dream was the worst. This time, the figure wasn't in the mural. I was alone in the alley, staring at the blank wall, when I felt a presence behind me. Slowly, I turned, and there it was, taller than I'd imagined, its limbs impossibly long, its body twisted and shadow-like. It leaned down until its face was inches from mine. "Why did you leave?" it whispered, its voice like dry leaves scraping against concrete. I woke up screaming. I haven't had the dream since, but I've made a point to avoid any mention of the mural, that city, or anything remotely connected to it. Whatever it was, I think it's still there, waiting for someone else to notice it, someone else to draw closer. Months passed, and I did my best to put the mural and its shadowy figure out of my mind. Life carried on in its usual, mundane way, though I couldn't shake the occasional feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't constant, but every so often, walking home at night, sitting alone in my apartment, I'd feel that creeping sensation of unseen eyes. I told myself it was paranoia, just the residual fear from my experience. One evening, while scrolling through my social media feed, a familiar image stopped me cold. It was a post from someone in an entirely different city, hundreds of miles from where I had seen the mural. The photo showed a mural of a tree identical to the one I'd obsessed over. Tiny figures in the branches, the intricate details of the bark. It was unmistakable. My heart sank as I squinted at the photo. There it was, almost hidden among the branches, the shadowy figure. But this time, it wasn't sitting or climbing. It was leaning out of the mural, one hand reaching toward the person taking the photo. The caption read, "Spotted this weird mural downtown today. Cool, but creepy. Anyone know the artist?" I stared at the screen, dread pulling in my stomach. It was spreading. Somehow, and possibly, the mural had moved, or been recreated, far from its original location. I couldn't understand it, but I knew one thing for certain, this wasn't normal. Against my better judgment, I messaged the person who had posted the photo. I asked where the mural was, trying to sound casual. They replied quickly, giving me the address. It was in a trendy part of their city, tucked away in an alley just like before. They mentioned they'd only noticed it that morning. I wanted to ignore it. I wanted to delete the message and pretend I hadn't seen anything, but the pull was too strong. I couldn't help myself. I booked a train ticket and made plans to visit the city that weekend. When I arrived, I wandered the streets for a while, half hoping I wouldn't find the mural. But I did. Tucked into a quiet alley, it was exactly as I remembered it. The sprawling tree, the tiny figures in the branches, and the shadowy figure that seemed sharper, more lifelike than before. It was no longer on the tree. It was standing on the ground as if it had stepped out of the mural. I backed away, my breath catching in my throat. It felt like it was watching me, and this time, I couldn't chalk it up to imagination. The air around the mural felt heavy, oppressive, like the weight of the figure's gaze was pressing against me. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see a man in a hoodie walking toward me. He didn't seem to notice the mural at all. In fact, he walked right past it without a second glance. Headed. I called after him, desperate for some kind of human interaction to ground myself. He turned, looking confused. Yeah, he asked. You didn't see the mural? I asked, my voice trembling. What mural? He glanced back at the wall, then at me, his expression skeptical. There's nothing there. My blood ran cold. I turned back to the mural, and sure enough, it was still there, as vivid and menacing as ever. But he couldn't see it. I thanked him and hurried out of the alley, my heart pounding. I didn't stop walking until I reached the safety of a crowded cafe, where I sat trembling, trying to process what had just happened. The mural was selective, visible to some, invisible to others. Why, I had no idea, but I was certain now that it wasn't just a painting. It was something else entirely, something that didn't belong in this world. That night, back in my hotel room, I received a message from an unknown number. It was just a photo, the mural, with the shadowy figure in its original position, standing under the tree. But this time, there was something new. At the base of the tree, barely visible, was a small figure, a person unmistakably me. I blocked the number, packed my things, and left the city before sunrise. I've moved 3 times since then, and I've avoided any alleys, murals, or public art that looks even remotely suspicious. But I can't shake the feeling that it's still watching me, still following me, waiting for the right moment to step out of the shadows for good. This happened about 5 years ago when I was fresh out of college and desperate for a job. I was applying to anything and everything I could find, and one day I received an email response to an application I didn't remember sending. The email was brief, but it looked professional enough. A marketing agency was interested in interviewing me for a position as a junior content strategist. The company name seemed familiar, though I couldn't quite place it. The interview was scheduled at a co-working space in the city, about 40 minutes from where I lived. The address was included in the email, and I figured maybe this was a smaller agency without a dedicated office yet. That's not uncommon for startups, so I didn't think too much of it. When I arrived, the co-working building was quiet but open, the lobby was well lit, and the receptionist barely glanced up as I walked in. I told her I was there for an interview, and she gestured toward the elevators, saying, "Second floor, room 217. As I got off the elevator, the atmosphere shifted. The second floor felt off. The air was colder, and there was an odd, chemical smell like cleaning supplies, but too strong. The hallway was lined with generic doors labeled with printed signs, law offices, freelance collectives, that sort of thing. Room 217 was at the end of the hall, with a plain black door and no window. I knocked, and a man opened the door. He looked ordinary enough, middle-aged, neatly dressed, glasses. But something about his smile immediately unsettled me. It was wide, too wide, like he was trying hard to seem friendly but was failing miserably. "Come in," he said, stepping aside. The room was sparse, a single desk, 2 chairs, and no personal touches at all. The walls were white, completely bare. I noticed there were no windows, which made the room feel claustrophobic. I sat down, and he started asking questions, not about the job, but about me. Personal questions. Did I live alone? Did I have family in the area? How long had I been looking for work? At first, I answered politely, thinking maybe this was his way of breaking the ice. But then he asked if I'd ever worked late nights alone. That's when my stomach dropped. I stammered something vague, trying to steer the conversation back to the job. "So, what does your agency specialize in?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned back, his smile fading, and stared at me for what felt like an eternity. "You seem nervous," he finally said. "Are you always this jumpy?" I froze. My gut was screaming at me to leave, but I didn't want to be rude or seem paranoid. I forced a laugh and stood up, saying I'd forgotten something in my car and would be right back. He didn't try to stop me, but his smile returned. This time, it felt predatory. As soon as I was out of the room, I bolted down the hallway and into the stairwell. I didn't stop until I was back in my car with the doors locked. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely start the engine. When I got home, I tried looking up the company again, but this time I dug deeper. It didn't exist. The website listed in the email was a generic template with no real content, just placeholders. The domain had been registered 2 weeks prior. I reported the incident to the co-working space and forwarded the email to local authorities, but I never heard anything back. To this day, I have no idea who that man was or what he wanted, but I'm certain it wasn't a job interview. After reporting the incident, I thought that was the end of it, it. I chalked it up to a creepy scam, something designed to lure in desperate job seekers, though I didn't want to imagine what the endgame might have been. A week later, I received another email. This one was from a different company, one I had applied to and actually wanted to work for. The email was polished, professional, and included a link to schedule an interview. I was still shaken from the previous experience, but this company had a solid reputation and an office in a prominent business district. It felt safe. I scheduled the interview for the following Tuesday. When the day arrived, I double-checked everything: the company's website, LinkedIn profiles of their employees, even their Glassdoor reviews. Everything checked out. The office was in a sleek, high-rise building. I arrived early, took the elevator to the 14th floor, and checked in at the front desk. The receptionist was kind and handed me a visitor badge. I waited in a well-furnished lounge area with other candidates, which reassured me further. It was a world away from the bare, windowless room of my previous interview. Finally, my name was called. A well-dressed woman greeted me and led me into a conference room. The interview started off normal, typical questions about my experience, my skills, and how I'd handle various work scenarios. About halfway through, though, things started to feel strange again. The interviewer, who had been friendly and professional up until that point, suddenly paused and looked at me intently. She asked, "Have you ever been contacted by anyone unusual while job hunting?" The question was so unexpected that I laughed nervously. "Oh yeah, I guess," I said. Why, she didn't answer right away. Instead, she glanced at the door as if checking to make sure no one else was listening. Then she leaned forward and lowered her voice. "We've heard reports of fake job postings targeting young professionals," she said. "A few of our applicants mentioned experiences that sound unsettlingly similar. It's important to be cautious." My stomach dropped. I asked her if she could elaborate, but she just smiled tightly and redirected the conversation back to the job. When the interview ended, she shook my hand and told me they'd be in touch. As I left the building, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her warning. It was as though she knew something she wasn't allowed to say. That night, I decided to do more digging. I searched for news articles, forums, and any reports about fraudulent job postings or suspicious incidents. To my surprise, I found several accounts from people in my city, some eerily similar to my own experience. All of them described interviews in odd locations where the interviewer asked invasive personal questions or displayed unsettling behavior. One account stood out. It was a post on a local forum from someone who had gone to a similar fake interview at a co-working space. They mentioned a room number 217 and a man with a too wide smile, but their story ended differently. They wrote that when they tried to leave, the man blocked the door and wouldn't let them go until they agreed to some vague terms. They'd eventually escaped by screaming for help, which attracted attention from someone in the hallway. The post was dated 2 weeks before my encounter. I reported everything I'd found to the authorities again, but just like before, I never heard back. Since then, I've been hyper-vigilant about any job offers or interviews, always verifying every detail. Sometimes I wonder if the woman at the second interview knew more than she let on. Was she genuinely trying to help, or did she know something darker? For a while, I managed to push the unsettling events to the back of my mind. Life moved on. I eventually found a job at a small but reputable company, and things started to feel normal again. However, every so often, I would think about that strange interview and the warning from the second recruiter. I tried not to dwell on it, but something about the whole ordeal felt unfinished. Then, about a year later, I received an email from an unfamiliar address. The subject line read, "Are you still looking for opportunities?" My heart sank as I opened it. The message was short and generic, offering an exciting role at a growing company, but it was the tone that got to me, eerily similar to the fake interview email from room 217. The email included a new location, a recently opened co-working space across town. It wasn't the same building, but it was close enough to make me uneasy. There were no red flags in the email itself, but I knew better this time. I ignored the email and blocked the sender. A few days later, another message arrived, this time from a different address but with the same wording. It felt like they were testing me, trying to bait me into replying. I ignored it again. The following week, I noticed something strange. While walking to my car after work, I saw a man standing near the parking lot entrance, seemingly waiting for someone. He was dressed casually but looked vaguely familiar. He didn't approach me or say anything, but his presence set me on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me. The next day, he was there again, standing in almost the exact same spot. This time, I didn't stick around. I got into my car and drove to a nearby coffee shop, waiting until I was sure he was gone before heading home. That night, I started piecing things together. The man looked a lot like the interviewer from room 217, older, glasses, that unsettling smile. I told myself it was just paranoia, but deep down, I knew it wasn't a coincidence. The emails kept coming, always from new addresses and with slightly different wording. One even mentioned the name of the company where I was now working, as if to make the offer seem more enticing. I knew they were watching me. Eventually, I reached out to a friend who worked in cybersecurity. I forwarded them the emails and told them everything. A few days later, they got back to me with some chilling news. The email domains were being registered under fake names and routed through international servers, making them nearly impossible to trace. Whoever was behind this knew what they were doing. That's when I decided enough was enough. I contacted the police again, this time with the new information and my friend's findings. They seemed more interested this time, especially when I mentioned the man near my workplace. They advised me to change my routine, avoid predictable patterns, and keep an eye out for anything unusual. I started driving a different route to work and leaving at random times. I'd even moved apartments, hoping to throw off anyone who might be tracking me. For a while, it seemed to work. The emails stopped, and I stopped seeing the man near my office. But every now and then, I get the feeling I'm being watched. A stranger lingering too long in a coffee shop, a car I lead a little too close to mine at a red light. Maybe it's just paranoia, but I can't shake the feeling that whoever was behind those fake interviews hasn't given up. To the man from room 217 and anyone else in your little network, I've done everything I could to avoid you. Let's not meet, because if we do, I'm not sure I'll make it out unscathed this time. A few years ago, I was traveling through a small city in Eastern Europe, the kind of place that doesn't make it onto tourist maps. I've been backpacking for months and like to wander aimlessly, hoping to find hidden gems off the beaten path. That's how I stumbled onto the underground market. It was a chilly, overcast day, and I ducked into a narrow alley to escape the wind. Halfway down the alley, I noticed a faint sign above a door. The sign was a mess of faded Cyrillic letters, but one word was clear: bizarre. Intrigued, I pushed open the door and descended a steep set of stone steps into the building's basement. This space was sprawling and dimly lit by rows of flickering fluorescent lights. It smelled faintly of damp concrete and spices. The stalls were a chaotic mix of junk, antiques, food, and oddities, old Soviet-era metals, jars of pickled vegetables, handmade jewelry, and stacks of books in languages I couldn't read. The air buzzed with conversation, though I couldn't catch a single word. One stall caught my eye. It was small and tucked away in a shadowy corner. The vendor, an older woman with piercing gray eyes and wiry hair, sat silently behind a table covered in neatly arranged trinkets. Most of her wares seemed mundane: old watches, tarnished coins, and worn playing cards. But there was one item that stood out: a small, black notebook. Its cover was leather, scratched and weathered with age, and it seemed oddly out of place. "How much?" I asked, pointing at the notebook. She tilted her head, as if assessing me, and then smiled. Her teeth were unnervingly sharp. "It's free, but you must promise to never open it in this market." I laughed awkwardly, assuming it was some quirky local superstition, and accepted the notebook. I slipped it into my bag and wandered the market a little longer, but something about the woman's gaze lingered in my mind. After a while, I decided to leave. As I climbed the stairs back to the street, I felt an inexplicable weight in my chest, like I was being watched. That night, in my hostel room, curiosity got the better of me. I pulled out the notebook and opened it. The pages were blank, except for the first one, which had a single line written in spidery handwriting. "You looked." Chills ran down my spine. I flipped through the rest of the pages, but they were all empty. I shoved the notebook back into my bag and told myself I just imagined it. The next morning, I woke to find the notebook on the bedside table, even though I was sure I'd put it away. This time, the second page had writing: "Leave the city." I don't know how to explain it, but I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The words didn't feel like a warning, they felt like a command. I decided not to test it. I packed my things and left the city on the next bus. A few days later, I was in a new city when I remembered the notebook. I pulled it out of my bag, but the pages were blank again. I tried to convince myself it had all been a weird coincidence, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd narrowly avoided something terrible. I never went back to that market, and I've kept the notebook locked away ever since. Sometimes, late at night, I think I hear faint scratching sounds coming from where it's hidden. I'm too afraid to check it. Despite the years that have passed, the notebook still haunts me. It's not something I've shared with many people because, honestly, who would believe me? The whole story sounds absurd, like something from a cheap horror novel, but I know it was real. I can still see the spidery handwriting and feel the icy dread it brought with it. I thought leaving it locked in an old box in the back of a closet would be the end of it, but the notebook hasn't let me forget. Every now and then, I dream about that market. It's always the same. I'm wandering those dimly lit aisles, hearing snippets of conversations in languages I don't understand. The stalls seem endless, and no matter how far I walk, I can't find the stairs to leave. The old woman is always there in her shadowy corner, her sharp teeth glinting as she smiles at me. I always wake up in a cold sweat, and the dreams seem to come more often now. Worse, I've started noticing strange things around my apartment. A faint, metallic smell that lingers in the air, objects shifting slightly when I know I haven't touched them. Once, I came home to find the closet door ajar, even though I always keep it shut. The box with the notebook was undisturbed, but I swear I heard faint scratching when I approached it. Last last week, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to get rid of the notebook for good. I drove to a secluded spot by a river far from where I live and threw it into the water. As it sank beneath the surface, I felt a wave of relief. For the first time in years, I thought it might actually be over. That night, I slept better than I had in months. But when I woke up, the notebook was back on my bedside table. It was open to a new page. The words written there sent a chill through me. You broke the promise. I don't know what to do anymore. I've thought about burning it, burying it, even taking it to some kind of paranormal experts, but deep down, I feel like nothing will work. I'm terrified that whatever is attached to this notebook isn't bound by the same rules as the rest of the world. The scratching has grown louder. I hear it now even when I'm not near the closet. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I hear faint whispers. I can't make out what they're saying, but the tone is angry. I'm writing this here because I don't know where else to turn. If anyone has experienced something similar, please let me know. I need to know a bowel load in this, and if you ever stumble across a strange market in a forgotten corner of the world, especially one run by a woman with shark teeth, do yourself a favor and walk away. Don't touch anything, don't take anything, and whatever you do, don't make any promises. Since writing this, things have taken an even darker turn. The whispers have become more distinct. I can't always catch the words, but they're sharp, guttural, and somehow feel as if they're being spoken directly into my mind. It's not just at night anymore. I hear them during the day, faint but persistent, no matter where I go. Last night, I decided to confront the notebook. I opened it for the first time since it reappeared on my bedside table. This time, the pages were no longer blank. Line after line was filled with phrases written in the same spidery handwriting. Some were in languages I didn't recognize, but the ones in English sent chills down my spine. You can't run. You belong to us. The deal is sealed. And at the bottom of the page, scrawled in larger, messier script, was a chilling message: return to the market. The thought of going back to that place makes my stomach churn, but I don't know what else to do. The energy around me feels heavier, suffocating. Shadows seem to move on their own, stretching toward me when I'm alone. My reflection in the mirror sometimes lingers a moment too long after I've turned away. This morning, I woke up with a fresh cut across my forearm. It wasn't deep, but it stung like a paper cut. The skin around it was red and inflamed, and the shape of the wound was eerily deliberate. It was a perfect X. I don't know how it got there. I live alone, and there's nothing in my apartment that could have done that accidentally. I've started seeing figures in my peripheral vision, blurred, indistinct shapes that vanish the moment I try to focus on them. Once, I swear I saw the old woman from the market standing in the corner of my bedroom, her sharp teeth glinting in the darkness. She didn't move, didn't speak, but her presence was suffocating. When I turned on the light, she was gone. I've decided to follow the notebook's instructions. As much as I fear what awaits me, I fear what might happen if I don't comply even more. I've booked a ticket back to the city. It's been years since I was there, and I don't even know if the market still exists, but I have to try. I feel like my life, or my soul, is hanging by a thread. To whoever reads this, if something happens to me, don't look for the market. Don't try to find the notebook. I don't think it's meant to be destroyed, and I don't think it can be escaped. I'll post an update once I get there if I can, but if you don't hear from me again, know this: the market is real, the notebook is real, and whatever is connected to it doesn't let go. A few years ago, I worked in a high-rise building downtown, the kind of place with sterile white hallways and endless cubicles. My office was on the 18th floor, and every morning, I would take the elevator up with a coffee in hand, dreading the monotony of the day ahead. One morning, I arrived earlier than usual to prep for a meeting. The elevator was strangely slow, so I opted for the stairwell. It was well lit, though eerily silent. As I climbed, I noticed a faint humming echoing through the space. It sounded like an old song, soft and haunting. By the time I reached the 12th floor, I decided to pause and catch my breath. The door to the 12th floor was slightly ajar, something I hadn't seen before. The 12th floor was under renovation. It had been closed for months, and no one was supposed to be there. Curious but cautious, I peeked inside. The humming was louder now, and I could see a woman sitting on the floor at the far end of the hallway. Her back was to me, and she was rocking slightly, humming that same tune. She wore a faded dress, one that seemed out of place, almost vintage. Her hair was long and disheveled. I hesitated. Something fell off. Excuse me, I called out, my voice echoing in the empty space. She stopped humming but didn't turn around. The silence stretched, pressing against my chest. I took a step back, my hand gripping the stairwell door. Before I could say anything else, she started humming again, louder this time, the tune discordant and grating. The rocking became more erratic. I bolted up the stairs without another glance, my heart pounding. When I reached my office, I told a coworker what I'd seen. He frowned and told me something that made my blood run cold. The 12th floor had been closed after a fire broke out 2 years years earlier. A woman, a secretary he thought, had died in the blaze. No one had been allowed back in since. I laughed it off, saying it was probably a squatter or someone who'd snuck in. But later that day, I overheard the building manager talking to security. They reviewed the cameras, and no one else had entered the stairwell that morning. A week later, I convinced myself the experience was just an overreaction. Stress, an early morning, and too much coffee had probably made my imagination run wild. Still, I avoided the stairwell. Every time I passed the closed-off door on the 12th floor while riding the elevator, my stomach churned. Then one evening, I had to work late. By the time I finished, it was past 9 p.m. and the office was eerily quiet. The elevator service had become unreliable after hours, often stopping for maintenance or getting stuck between floors. I debated waiting for it but decided to take the stairs to avoid being trapped. The stairwell was dimly lit now, with only every other bulb working. I kept my steps brisk, my shoes echoing sharply against the concrete. As I descended past the 13th floor, I noticed the door to the 12th floor was ajar again. My breath hitched, but I kept moving. That humming started again. It was faint at first, as if the sound was carried by the air itself. I froze. The melody was unmistakable, the same haunting tune I'd heard before. I couldn't resist looking through the small glass pane of the 12th floor door. The hallway beyond was darker than I remembered, with shadows stretching unnaturally across the walls. And there she was again, standing this time. Her back was still to me, but she was swaying side to side like before. Her head tilted slightly, as if she were listening for something. "Leave," I whispered to myself, but I couldn't move. As if she'd heard me, she stopped swaying. Slowly, she began to turn her head, but her body remained unnaturally still, her neck twisting further than seemed possible. I stumbled back, tripping over a step as her face came into view. Her eyes were black hollows, her mouth stretched into a wide, unnatural grin. The humming was no longer soft. It filled the entire stairwell, a chaotic, discordant wail. I scrambled to my feet and bolted down the stairs, skipping steps and gripping the railing so hard my knuckles turned white. I didn't stop until I was outside on the sidewalk, gulping in the cold night air. I looked up at the building, half expecting to see her peering out from one of the windows. But the 12th floor was dark, as it always was. The next day, I filed a formal complaint with building management. I didn't go into detail, just said there was something strange on the 12th floor. They dismissed it, saying it was impossible for anyone to access the space. It had been sealed for asbestos removal after the fire. I never took the stairs again, not even during fire drills. I quit the job a few months later, and every time I pass that building downtown, I feel a chill run down my spine. Months after I quit that job, I thought I put the experience behind me. I even started laughing it off when recounting it to close friends over drinks, turning it into one of those crazy work stories people tell to spice up dull conversations. But deep down, I knew I wasn't being entirely honest. The memories still haunted me in quiet moments, creepy back when I was alone or in dark, silent spaces. One night, about a year later, I woke up at 3:12 a.m., the kind of waking where your body feels electrified, like it knows something your mind hasn't caught up to yet. My apartment was silent, save for the faint hum of my refrigerator. But something felt wrong. My ears strained against the quiet. That's when I heard it, a faint, familiar humming. I sat bolt upright, my pulse thundering in my ears. The sound wasn't coming from outside, it was inside, drifting from somewhere down the hall. My stomach dropped as I realized it wasn't a song from a passing car or a neighbor's late night TV. It was the same haunting tune from the 12th floor. "No," I whispered, shaking my head as if denying it would make it disappear. The humming grew louder, more erratic, as though whoever or whatever was making it was drawing closer. My eyes darted to my bedroom door, slightly ajar, revealing the dark hallway beyond. I didn't remember leaving it open. I wanted to move, to grab my phone, to turn on a light, anything, but my body wouldn't respond. I was frozen in place, every muscle locked in terror. Then I saw it. A shadow passed through the sliver of light in the hallway, faint but unmistakable. It stopped, and the humming ceased abruptly. The silence that followed was even worse. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the crack of the door, waiting, hoping it was my imagination. And then a whisper, low, guttural, and unmistakable, "Come see." The door creaked open slightly, just enough for me to glimpse a figure standing at the end of the hallway. My blood turned to ice. It was her, the same woman from the 12th floor. Her face was even more distorted than I remembered, the grin impossibly wide, her hollow eyes locked onto mine. She didn't move, but the air around her seemed to shimmer and bend, as though she was barely tethered to reality. I don't remember how I finally managed to move, but the next thing I knew, I was running out of my apartment barefoot, not even bothering to grab my keys. I fled down the street, not stopping until I reached an all-night diner where I sat shaking until sunrise. When I returned home later that morning, exhausted and half convinced I'd imagined the whole thing, I found my apartment door ajar. Nothing was missing, but the place felt rugged. The air was heavy, and there was an unfamiliar smell, faintly metallic, like burnt wires. I moved out the next week, breaking my lease without a second thought. I've never experienced anything like it since, but sometimes Sometimes, when I'm alone in the quiet hours of the night, I'll hear the faintest hum in the distance. This happened a couple of years ago when I was working part-time as a receptionist at a small law firm downtown. It wasn't a flashy place, just an office suite on the 4th floor of an older building. The work was monotonous but easy: answer the phone, greet clients, and sort the mail. One afternoon, a man walked and carried a thick stack of folders. He looked completely unremarkable, mid-40s, thinning hair, wearing a beige suit that had seen better days. He smiled politely and said he had a delivery for one of the attorneys, Mr. Hill. I asked if he had an appointment, and he said no, but he insisted Mr. Hill was expecting him. I didn't recognize him, but Mr. Hill often had walk-in clients, so I didn't think much of it. I called Mr. Hill's office to let him know someone was here for him. Mr. Hill sounded confused and said he didn't know anyone by that description. When I relayed this to the man, his demeanor changed. The polite smile vanished, replaced by a look that made my skin crawl. "Just tell him it's urgent," he said, his tone sharp. "Who knows to say those?" He tapped the folders on the counter with an intensity that felt almost threatening. At this point, I started to feel uneasy, but I nodded and called Mr. Hill again. This time, he sounded annoyed. "I don't know who this guy is, and I'm not seeing him. Tell him to leave." When I relayed the message, the man's face darkened. He didn't say anything for a long moment, just stood there staring at me. Then he leaned in closer, too close, and whispered, "He'll regret this." I froze. My heart was pounding, but I managed to keep my voice steady as I told him he needed to leave. He finally backed away, but as he reached the door, he turned back and said, "You should be careful, too. Some secrets are dangerous." After he left, I locked the door and called building security. They took a report but didn't seem overly concerned. When I told Mr. Hill what had happened, he brushed it off, saying he had no idea who the man was or what he could have wanted. The whole thing felt off, but I tried to move on. A week later, I found a single folder on the reception desk when I came in for my shift. I didn't know how it had gotten there. There was no sign of forced entry, and no one else had access to the office. The folder was labeled with my name in blocky, uneven handwriting. Inside were pages and pages of photocopied documents, court records, old newspaper clippings, and what looked like medical reports. As I flipped through them, I realized they all had one thing in common: a recurring name. My last name. It was a name I didn't recognize, tied to events and people I had no connection to. Or so I thought. When I showed the folder to Mr. Hill and the office manager, they both looked concerned but couldn't make sense of it. We reported it to the police, but without any clear threat. They didn't have much to go on. They quit that job not long after. I didn't feel safe there anymore, especially knowing the man hadn't been caught or identified. I still think about that day sometimes, wondering who he was and how he knew my name. I don't work in offices anymore, and I've moved twice since then, but every now and then, I catch a glimpse of a beige suit or a stack of folders, and my heart races. After I left the law firm, I tried my best to put the incident behind me, but even after I started my new job at a small boutique, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It wasn't constant, but every so often, I'd catch someone staring just a moment too long or notice a figure lingering at the edge of my vision. I told myself it was paranoia, that I was overreacting. Still, I couldn't ignore the knots of unease that tightened in my chest whenever I thought about that man. A few months later, I received a package at my apartment. It was strange because I hadn't ordered anything, and the sender's address was blank. My stomach dropped when I saw my name scrawled across the front in the same uneven handwriting from the folder at the office. Inside was an unmarked USB drive and a single slip of paper. The paper read, "You deserve to know the truth." I debated whether to throw it away, but curiosity got the better of me. Against my better judgment, I plugged the USB into my laptop. It contained dozens of files, photos, scanned documents, and videos. As I opened the first folder, a chill ran down my spine. The photos were of me. Some were from years ago, pictures of me at college events, with friends, even family gatherings I didn't remember being photographed at. Others were more recent, including shots of me at the law firm and in my new neighborhood. Whoever had taken them had been watching me for a long time. I felt sick. My hands were shaking as I opened one of the scanned documents. It was a birth certificate, mine, but beneath my name was a note written in red ink, not her real name. The other documents were just as bizarre: legal papers about a child custody battle from decades ago, hospital records mentioning a Jane Doe infant, and police reports tied to missing persons cases. One of the videos was surveillance footage of a hospital hallway showing a woman I didn't recognize walking out with a bundled up baby. The timestamp was from the year I was born. I slammed my laptop shut and immediately called the police. They sent someone over to collect the USB drive and the package, but once again, there wasn't much they could do. The officers suggested I stay with a friend for a while, just to be safe, and I took their advice. For weeks, I was too afraid to go home. I stayed with my best friend, Emma, and told her everything. She tried to reassure me, saying it was probably just a stalker trying to mess with my head, but her concern was obvious. Then, one night, while we were watching TV, Emma's dog started barking at the front door. It was a low, growling bark, the kind he only made when something was wrong. I peeked out the window, but the street was empty. I tried to shake it off, but the dog wouldn't settle down. When Emma opened the door to check, she found another package sitting on the doormat. This one was smaller, wrapped in plain brown paper with no note attached. She wanted to throw it away immediately, but I couldn't. I had to know what was inside. We opened it together. Inside was a single Polaroid photo of a young girl, maybe 5 or 6 years old, standing next to the man with the folders. They were in front of a house I didn't recognize, but the girl looked oddly familiar. Beneath the photo, someone had scribbled, "You were never supposed to leave." They called the police again, but just like before, there wasn't much they could do. The officers said the photo could have been doctored and that without a clear thread, there wasn't enough evidence to investigate further. I started to feel like I was losing my mind. A few nights later, I woke up to the sound of knocking on Emma's door. It was just after 3 a.m. Emma and I froze, staring at each other as the knocking grew louder and more frantic. We didn't answer, and after what felt like an eternity, it stopped. When we checked the peephole in the morning, no one was there, but scratched into the wood of the door was a single word: leave. I've moved again since then, this time to another state. I've changed my phone number, deleted my social media, and done everything I could to disappear. But no matter where I go, I can't shake the feeling that someone is still watching me, waiting for the right moment to reach out again. After moving to another state, I did everything possible to erase my tracks. I got a new name for my mailbox, rented a place under a pseudonym, and used a VPN for everything online. I even started seeing a therapist to help me deal with the anxiety that had become my constant companion. For a while, it seemed to work. Months passed without any strange packages or unnerving encounters, and I started to believe I could rebuild my life. But then, late one evening, I got a phone call. The number was unknown, and I debated letting it go to voicemail, but something compelled me to answer. I immediately regretted it. At first, there was silence. Then a man's voice, low and calm, said, "You can't hide forever." I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Before I could respond, the line went dead. I sat there, staring at my phone, my mind racing. I tried to convince myself it was a prank call, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I reported it to the police in my new city, but there wasn't much they could do. They suggested changing my number again, which I did, but the damage was done. The fragile sense of security I had built was shattered. A week later, I came home from work to find my apartment door slightly ajar. My heart sank. I was certain I had locked it that morning. I hesitated, debating whether to go inside or call the police. Ultimately, I chose the latter. When the officers arrived and cleared the apartment, they didn't find anyone, but they did find something on my kitchen table, a single folder identical to the ones the man had carried into the law firm all those months ago. Inside was a handwritten note: "You keep running, but you're only making it worse. Stop now, and I'll explain everything." The rest of the folder was filled with more of the same: photos of me, documents with my name on them, and, most chilling of all, a timeline of my moves since leaving the law firm. They knew everything, every address, every job, every attempt I had made to start over. The police took the folder as evidence, but I knew what they'd say. No direct threat, nothing actionable. Once again, I was on my own. That night, I packed a bag and checked into a hotel under an alias. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not even Emma. I couldn't risk it. I stayed there for a week, trying to figure out my next move. On the 6th night, I woke up to a strange sound, the rustling of paper. I turned on the bedside lamp and froze. The small desk in the corner of the room was covered in folders, dozens of them. They hadn't been there when I went to bed. On top of the pile was another note: "You can't run from the truth. It's time to come home." I grabbed my bag and ran. I didn't even bother checking out of the hotel. I drove until I was out of the state, pulling over only when I couldn't keep my eyes open any longer. Now, I'm constantly on the move, never staying in one place for more than a few days. I don't use my real name for anything, and I avoid making connections with people. It's a lonely existence, but it feels like the only way to stay safe. Sometimes, I think about that man with the folders and the cryptic messages he left me. Who was he? What did he mean by the truth? Part of me wants to find out, to confront him and end this nightmare once and for all. But another part of me is terrified of what I might discover. Alright, but that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But as always,
Have a nice day.